Good morning. How is it? Everybody's doing good? Ready for round two? If you were here yesterday, we are very excited. Welcome for this series. My name is AP Duran. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities. It's our pleasure to welcome here for this new series, the Dorrance, in collaboration with the Dorrance Scholarship Programs, that we thank again for their support, as well as Bernard Dorrance, one of our alumni from the College of Humanities. This series entitled Humanities, Innovators in a Tech World. Before I forget, a few logistics announcements. If you could please make sure that you turn off your cell phones so that during the presentation we don't have to worry about that. The other thing in regards to the logistics, if you were not here yesterday and you were not able to make it but will still want to watch the presentation, they are available on our website. This is being broadcast live. We are on live stream as well, and later on today the presentation will also be posted. And I want to thank all the speakers who gave us permission to do that, and we really appreciate it to be able to share that with our audience. Another logistic part that I wanted to announce, and I'll explain this again and remind you of it a little bit later. For our first speaker, who I'm about to introduce, there will be a possibility to get a copy of his book and to have a book signing session that will happen right outside after the second presentation today. So I will remind you, but in case some of you plan to stay a little bit longer or have to leave earlier, you know, this is what we're going to do, so I will remind everybody at the end of the first presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce now our first speaker of the day, of this, again, series of the College of the Humanities of the 21st century. And I think you're going to continue to see that today with the different speakers. The first speaker today is Scott Hartley. Scott Hartley is a venture capitalist and author of the 2017 best-selling book, The Fuzzy and the Techie, Why the Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World. We really like that title. I was telling Scott that anywhere I go, in any meeting, you know, I have a lot of ready quotes from the book that I use all the time, especially with the administration. That book was a Financial Times Business Book of the Month and finalist for the Financial Times and McKinsey & Company's Bracken Bauer Prize for an author under 35. He is a global keynote speaker on future of work and human skills in our technology age. In 2013, he was selected as a Presidential Innovation Fellow and spent 8 months working in the White House Domestic Policy Council. Prior to working in venture capital, Mr. Hartley worked at Google, Facebook, and Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. He has been a contributing author at MIT Press and has written for publications such as Quartz, the Financial Times, and Foreign Policy, and been featured in USA Today, Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal. He holds 3 degrees from Stanford and Columbia, has finished 6 marathons and Ironman triathlons. He is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations and has visited over 70 countries. The title of his presentation today is, and we really like that title too, Humanizing Our Technology. Please welcome Scott Hartley.
Thank you so much. All right. Wow, what an introduction. Well, it's my great pleasure to be here with you all of the Dorrance scholars, all of the faculty, and other community attendees. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about humanizing technology from my background, which mostly is from Silicon Valley. I live in New York, between San Francisco and New York now, so I was able to escape the terrible weather we have back east and come to beautiful Tucson last night. So without further ado, I will dive in here on humanizing our technology. So if I take you guys back about 60 years to 1959, there was this gentleman on the screen here, Charles Percy Snow. And C.P. Snow, he was a physicist, but he was also a novelist. He was somebody who straddled sort of the sciences and the humanities. He was famous for delivering a lecture at Cambridge University where he basically talked about this divide between what he saw the sciences and the humanities not talking to each other, not speaking the same language. And if we think about this, the sciences, are the study of the natural world, the world around us, and the humanities are the contextualization of ourselves, human beings, within the natural world, the study of our human condition. And this lecture that C.P. Snow delivered, it became known as his Two Cultures lecture. And in this lecture, he really lamented this chasm that he saw developing due to, whether it was due to organizational requirements of siloing the sciences on one side of campus and the humanities on another side of campus. But he really said, we have people that are studying thermodynamics that never read Shakespeare, and we've got people, doing the opposite. And we really have got to get people to speak the same language. And I think if we fast forward, 60 years to today, from 1959 all the way up to 2018, we have in some ways the same two cultures debate, the same sort of dichotomy between issues that we're talking about in the media. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence and AI. I think we're only starting to scratch the surface and talk a little bit about the ethics behind, if we have work schedules and things that are driven by algorithmic processes, what does this mean? Who's in the room? Who's deciding these processes? We talk a lot about learning to code, but we forget that code is only so relevant as how we apply the code to technological issues. It really requires the context of understanding human problems, which requires the study, again, of the humanities, of our place within the natural world. And I think in the last few weeks, we've started to scratch the surface with Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress of these real issues between data and privacy, openness and security. And so again, these are technology issues on one hand, but then they're also very much humanities issues, social science issues, issues of ethics and governance. And so we talk a lot about STEM and the science, technology, engineering, and math being a really important component and a skill set that we've all got to develop in some way, shape, or form to participate in this new technology world. But at the same time, it's not an either or. It's not one versus the other. It's really, again, back to C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures. How do we bring these two sides together? And I think if we go all the way back to antiquity, back to the Greeks and thousands of years ago, the notion of liberal arts, or artis liberalis from Latin, really was about freeing the mind. It wasn't about studying one thing or another. It was about studying all things. It was about tugging on the mind in different directions, where you were exposed to the natural sciences, you were exposed to the humanities, to great literature, logic, philosophy. And I think getting back to the core notion of what this means, to AP's point, the second deck of the book, Why the Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World, I think it's taking these concepts back to their origination and applying these methodologies to our technology world. So people often ask me, they say, you wrote this book, but what's on your shelf? What's on your bedside table? What are the things that you're thinking about or reading? And I think the two most recent books that I read both speak to this sort of intersection of science and humanities. Carlo Rovelli, who's an astrophysicist, who I know yesterday you guys heard about cosmology and sort of the nature of the universe. Carlo Rovelli, he studies quantum gravity. He's very much a cosmologist, very much a physicist, but the circle goes all the way around, and he really is also a philosopher. At the core of cosmology is a lot of philosophical, metaphysical, these big questions that we have in the world. And similarly, E.O. Wilson is a biologist who's spent his entire career studying ants and insects, but the learnings from that can be applied to artificial intelligence. They can be applied to really simplistic organisms that when you multiply them out across thousands of them working in unison, creates an intelligent sort of hive mind, similar to ways that we think about artificial intelligence today. So E.O. Wilson is a biologist, but here he has a book on the origins of creativity. And I think that this speaks to, I love this quote that I came across recently by F. Scott Fitzgerald, where he says, "The test of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." Right. So again, about this full circle, sort of not just being a physicist, but being a philosopher. They seem like these oppositional ideas, but they're really not. They're the same thing. So I won't dwell too long on this slide because I know it's a rival school up the coast. But I come from Palo Alto, California, and sort of the heart of Silicon Valley. It looks a little bit like we're missing the saguaro cactus. That's what we really got to get up there. But you might say, well, these terms, the fuzzy and the techie, where did this guy come up with these terms? They actually, they come from Stanford, going back to the 1970s or so. And they were really these lighthearted associations on campus that have remained sort of in the lexicon of the university, where people, students would ask, are you taking more fuzzy classes this quarter or more techie classes this quarter? Are you more of a fuzzy, more of a techie? But it was sort of this, again, this false opposition. So I wrote this book, which AP mentioned we'll have available outside later. But it speaks to the sort of false divide between the fuzzies and the techies. Because really, when you kind of dig into it, you can be a highly creative systems engineer, somebody who views structures and views solving systems level problems, which is a highly creative process. So it's not as if engineers are not creative people. They can be highly creative. And on the flip side, just because you study social science, you may identify, like I did, as a political science major, political theory, but I took a lot of international relations as a fuzzy. But then you're using statistical software. You're engaged with with technology in other ways. You're using data-driven processes, or you're looking at game theory in the case of nuclear deterrence, things like that. And so again, this false opposition, even though it's a fuzzy subject, there's technical aspects, and even though you may study engineering, there's lots of aspects of social science. If you talk to an engineer building a product, they have to interview all of their potential customers. Like, what is this product going to do? That looks a lot like anthropology research, a lot like ethnographic research. So when I zoomed out and I took a step back from where I was working in Silicon Valley, we had such a monoculture of this viewpoint that technology is just about the techies. And really, we sort of lionize, we put the techie on the pedestal, but it's not the single path. Just because we look at someone like Mark Zuckerberg, we think of him as a techie, but we forget that he went to a liberal arts high school, he speaks Chinese, he reads great literature. He's actually a fairly well-rounded individual. We were hearing some of these statements out of Silicon Valley, like Vinod Khosla, who's a venture capitalist, was down the street from my old firm, but he founded a company called Sun Microsystems. And Vinod has been outspoken in saying things like, little of the material taught in the liberal arts programs today is relevant in the future. It's kind of a weighty statement. I think he's backpedaled a little bit since this. But there's a lot in there, going back to those slides about data and privacy, and the main challenges that these technology companies are facing are predominantly, they're predominantly in the social sciences and the humanities. And the other thing was, I looked around Silicon Valley and I said, wait a minute, I hear Vinod Khosla saying things like, little of the liberal arts is relevant, and then you take a look at who's running every company in Silicon Valley and you say, wait a minute, they're all philosophers, they're history majors, even techie products like Reddit. Alexis Ohanian, he's a history major from the University of Virginia. You look at LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman studied philosophy and linguistics. You look at YouTube, Susan Wojcicki, who runs YouTube, was a history and literature major. So just taking a look around Silicon Valley at the skill sets and the soft skills that real leaders have in these organizations made me want to write this book, sort of the counter-narrative about Silicon Valley. And then you hear people like Mark Cuban saying, I personally think that there's going to be greater demand in 10 years for liberal arts majors than there were for programming majors, or maybe even engineering, which is a bold statement, but I'm going to talk a little bit today about why I think that Mark Cuban is more right than wrong. So the sort of takeaway is that technical literacy is important. It's not anti-STEM or anti-learning to engage with technology. If anything, that's my world. That's kind of where I've spent the last 10, 15 years of my career. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's all these other things we've got to round out the technical skills with. So Stuart Butterfield, who's one of the key innovators of the day, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the company Slack. Do you guys use that in classes and different ways of communication? So Slack is sort of a competitor to email, if you will. It's a way you can add hashtags and tagging, attribution, and sort of keep track of conversations and different themes. But Stuart Butterfield, he actually has 2 degrees in philosophy. And he talks about the benefits of learning to really be able to communicate clearly through writing, which is something that Jeff Bezos talks a lot about. Every single meeting at Amazon begins with basically a 10-page memo that everyone sits there and reads from start to finish before they can have any opinion about whether they think it's a good idea or a bad idea. They've got to sit there and read for 10 minutes. And Stuart Butterfield talks about how the other issue is being able to follow an argument all the way down. And I think for anyone who's led a team or tried to build a product, you realize that these are gray areas. There's no black and white answer. And the methodologies that we learn in degrees like philosophy, these are things where we learn to grapple with ambiguities. We learn to sort of debate and interrogate an idea all the way to its core. And so those are the core principles that are, we don't have an A to A relationship like you can study engineering, become an engineer, but you study philosophy, you certainly have the skill set to become a product manager or a CEO. Those are definitely the skill sets that people like Stuart Butterfield have taken all the way to the top of their careers. And so the greatest challenges of technology today, I would argue, are actually these ones that I mentioned that are social, that are psychological, philosophical, and ethical. If we look at self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of consensus that the technology is basically there to be able to have cars, that can stay within a lane on a highway. But the big challenges are they're legal, they're regulatory, they're dealing with mixed use environments. So for the foreseeable future, we can't possibly have all autonomous cars. We have to have some cars that are driven by you and me on the roads, making mistakes, cutting people off, changing lanes without our blinkers on. So how do you deal with that, right? Those are the real challenges of, communication across cultures, communication across geographies. How do you bring that into code? How do you contextualize for what a head nod means to a Nissan car waiting at a stop sign, whether that stop sign's in Tucson or it's in New York City? These are the real challenges of how you codify into code these processes that have to deal with the ambiguities of human beings, right? So most of the people, if you talk to executives at Waymo, which is Google's self-driving car team, they'll tell you that the challenges are actually anthropological. They're not really technical. So they're really looking for people that can figure out how to ask the right questions and help train the data, train the engineers to code these things so that they can actually be effective on the streets. And if you look at somebody, Tracy Chow is a great example of somebody who studied technology. She studied electrical engineering and computer science. But since graduation, she's actually come forth and written a bunch of articles about how she wishes she had studied some of the soft skills. She wishes she had taken more philosophy classes. She actually was an early product manager at a company called Quora, which is a question and answer website. And she was also at Pinterest. And she realized that she was one of the people leading a team of engineers, but the challenges that they had when they were whiteboarding the product, when they were going out for beers late at night to try to figure out the direction of where they wanted to take the company, she realized that all of these challenges, again, were dealing with, are users going to be inherently good? Are they going to be bad? If they're bad and they abuse our terms of service, do we retroactively take down content like on YouTube, or do we have to have moderation cues? So the whole product roadmap was basically starting with a philosophy question of human nature. So they said, are people inherently good or bad? If any of you have taken Philosophy 101, this is a pretty basic question that there is no answer. We got to debate this for hours and hours, and we're going to make determinations that then get looped into product, looped into how we focus the entire company based on an origination, which is a philosophy question. And so these are the realities of all these tech companies. They're not just purely technical. And so she's become a real advocate of blending both in her own learning, studying more soft skills, more liberal arts, and also in how she composes her teams, thinking about how do we engage both philosophers and engineers working together on similar teams. Similarly, someone named Tristan Harris, are any of you guys familiar with Tristan's work? No? One in the back. So Tristan Harris, he was an entrepreneur in his own right. He sold a company to Google. And when he got to Google, he started looking around and he said, there are very few people at this company who are making these determinations where the products are touching the lives, not of thousands of people or millions of people, but in some cases, billions of people. And so what are the ways that we're thinking about getting the right conversations, the right questions in those rooms? Should there be more diversity in those rooms? How do we think about those big questions? And so Tristan started, he became Google's design philosopher, and then he's since left and focused on two movements. One he calls time well spent, where he thinks about technology and how we can actually make technology help us spend time in a more meaningful way as people. And then he's created something called the Center for Humane Technology. So again, sort of bringing these philosophers and engineers together, just like what Tracy's advocating for. And Tristan, his main observation was he went back to what the personal computer was created for. And Steve Jobs has this famous quote where he says, personal computer should be a bicycle for the mind. It should be something that enables us to learn and to connect with other people. It should be, something that takes us on a journey. And Tristan's observation was that it's changed and it's really become more of a slot machine in our pockets, where you go to Vegas and you pull a one-armed bandit, that you pull the lever on the side and it takes your money. And many of us pull our phones out of our pocket and we the one-finger bandit, where you start scrolling and scrolling and 15 minutes goes by and you say, gosh, where did that time go? Oh, I guess I was looking at Instagram. And in many ways, that's sort of the same dynamics as what a slot machine has. So you have variable reward structures where, for Twitter, for example, if you open your Twitter app and you wait that 1 second before the red dot appears that says somebody retweeted your tweet or something like that, you think that just arbitrarily turns red at a certain time. No, it's been A/B tested hundreds of times to figure out the sweet spot of the variable reward that leads to the highest engagement. And so, these are the realities of the technology. In many ways, Tristan's observation was it's become addictive by design. And anyone who's watched Netflix, like I have, and stayed up all night watching Stranger Things, you'll know that countdown, that's the 3, 2, 1, the next episode is about to begin, it keeps you hooked. And it's not an arbitrary decision. That's a design lever that they've used on purpose to try to increase engagement. And so, Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, wonderful man, but he talks about his competition being human sleep, right? So, it's again, these questions, these ethical questions that get baked into products. How do we think about these things? And so the big question is, what is our technology optimizing for, and who gets to determine this? Because really, we think about if we build it, people will do whatever with our technology is not quite true. It's not just agnostic on its own. It has all of these menus and choices and framings and principles that are baked into the technology itself. So who's sitting in those product manager rooms making these determinations? Is it a diverse team? Is there input from an outside perspective? Should we have other people observing what is going on in these rooms if they're touching the lives of 1 billion people? These are big philosophy questions, right? These are big sociological or governance questions. And so again, it's not sort of pure technology on one side, pure humanities on the other side. Again, this is like the same thing. And so, who gets to decide our values is kind of my question. And I think the question that Tristan poses. And we focus some on the negative. We talk about sort of the slot machine in our pocket, but these levers can also be used for incredibly productive things. So this company, Omada Health, what they've done is they've taken design levers, sort of ways of creating addictive behavior, but they've used it to try to nudge people off the couch, nudge people to be a little more engaged, get more steps in their lives, because they've realized that a more active lifestyle leads to less susceptibility to type 2 diabetes. And so they integrate social dynamics of sharing things via social media, a connected scale, sort of Internet of Things device, and a lot of these behavioral levers to try to get people more active. So you say, well, maybe the Twitter notification is not a good thing, but the Omada Health is a good thing. Again, these are kind of gray area questions. Similarly, Talkspace is an app where they created an ability to connect with a therapist over text message. And it's a really wonderful platform because it's opened up the ability of different communities, people that may not seek out mental health in their life, the ability to connect. So they've been really successful in veteran communities. They've been successful in fraternities on college campuses. But I think these are questions of when is it sort of the right nudge, when is it the wrong nudge? And so this concept of ethics, of nudging behavior in certain ways, who gets to make these determinations? So where I live in New York, you think, how much do you want to tip? This is a self-determined thing. I make the choice. I get into the back of a taxi cab and I decide how much I want to tip the driver. But actually, my decision is pretty much based on the menu of choices that I'm given. So it's a good example of technology sort of nudging me in a certain direction. So when they changed the buttons on the back of the little video screen there you get in the cab, it used to be 15, 20, and 25%. And a couple years ago, they changed this. And a couple scholars at Columbia University Chicago, they looked at the uptick. And you might think, well, this is just an arbitrary thing. I make my own determinations about how much I want to tip. But the truth is that most people don't have the extra cash to be the big tipper, and they don't want to be the cheapskate. So they picked the middle button. And pretty much everyone does that. And so what this meant was that tips for the average driver went up by $600. So these are the examples of where the menu of choices changes, and again, it's not just agnostic, it's that there are people making these determinations behind every menu of our technology, and they really do push us in one way or the other. So if we extrapolate this idea out into something that we can't see as readily, an algorithm, where it's really codified and rolled up into a process of ones and zeros, we see that there are real risks that we kind of package these up into one system or another. And actually in 2016, the White House released a report where they said the algorithmic systems that turn data into information are not infallible. They rely on the imperfect inputs, logic, probability of the people who design them, right? So there are real people behind these processes. They're making certain determinations. They have certain biases, certain propensities. And if we look at something like predictive policing, we get into the heart of a really thorny issue, right? You look at where is data collected on different crimes. Well, crimes are committed, but the data that we have on crimes is based on reported crime data, right? And reported crime data has all sorts of baggage around sociological, urban development, criminological. There are all these other things that are implicit beneath the surface of just a data set. And so you might say, well, this is just a technology issue. It's just an algorithm run by a couple engineers. But actually, the data is pulled from a certain precinct. The precinct has certain underlying issues. And so it's a really, it's a much broader issue than just a technology issue, than just an algorithmic issue. And there's a journalist named Malik, where he talks about this sort of future, almost dystopian world where there's an element of this data Darwinism. We're leaving behind trails of data. And if we're not asking the right questions, we're just packaging this data up. We're just putting it into different systems, and the biases are just getting expanded out through black box processes known as algorithms, right? So at Palantir, which is a big data company, one of the engineers recently made this comment. He said, computers don't ask moral questions, people do. At a company like ours with millions of lines of code, every tiny decision could have huge implications. So again, it comes back to us asking the right questions, having the right diversity in the room, having the right people kind of pushing back, going back to the concept of liberal arts, tugging on the mind in different ways, being uncomfortable with ambiguity, posing these deep questions, grappling and interrogating ideas. I think these are the core things that our technology really needs today. Otherwise, for the other people in the room who might watch this show, there's a dystopian reality. I think they've done a great job of thinking about logically extending out if, these processes, if we're not asking the right questions, what could go sideways? What does this future world look like that's driven by algorithms and machine learning, that's not sort of tamed or not questioned, not interrogated by the right the right smart people that are in this room. And so again, I don't want to focus on the negative because there are incredible things that algorithms also do, right? So Katrina Lake, she was actually a classmate of mine, and she's now the CEO of a company called Stitch Fix. And anyone in the room knows Stitch Fix. It's basically Netflix for your closet. So Stitch Fix is a machine learning company, and it's a way to go shopping, but there's no shopping cart, there's no buy button. All you do is you go to a site and you answer a bunch of questions, and they take off the basis of those questions, they extrapolate out your preferences, and then they start serving you clothes in a box that comes to your house. And so Katrina, she was not a technologist. She studied political science and economics, and she really liked retail, and she observed this problem, and she said, this is something that I really want to go after. And she knew that she needed to have somebody who understood logistics and somebody who understood machine learning, and she had the charisma to go and sell the story, sell the vision. So she didn't have the technical ability to build the machine learning algorithms, excuse me, but she did have the ability to sell this vision. And so she found a guy named Eric Colson who built the algorithms for Netflix. And with Eric, they developed this system of what he calls his H+M algorithm. So he uses machine learning to sort massive amounts of data. Machines are really good at that. But then serve that to human stylists that do the last mile delivery and actually engage with the clients. And what's interesting is we have this ability, or with this perspective where we talk about, machine learning company is going to eliminate jobs. But if you look at a company like Stitch Fix, they're doing $1 billion in revenue. They've got 80 data scientists, but there's 4,000 people on the front lines. Those 4,000 people are actually the ones talking to customers. They receive a sort of a select list driven by machine learning, but then they take that and they say, well, you're based in Charleston, South Carolina, and you've got a wedding this weekend. I think you're going to like this versus that. So they're doing all of the last mile customization. And I think this notion, not just of pure AI, but of using machine learning to mitigate bias, using machine learning to sort of help supplement the human, these are the ways that when we talk about some of these new technologies, these are the ways that they're kind of hitting the pavement in real life. And so in many ways, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but going back to the 1950s, there was a debate between two different scholars at MIT, Marvin Minsky and J.C.R. Licklider, and they had this debate about whether or not it was going to be AI or it was going to be intelligence amplification or intelligence augmentation. And I think in many ways, what we see today is more IA than it is AI. Similarly, Fei-Fei Li, she's actually on the back of the book. In Fei-Fei, she runs all of AI and machine learning at Google Cloud, which is sort of Google's Amazon Web Services. And she says, I often tell my students not to be misled by the name artificial intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it. AI is made by humans, intended to behave by humans, and ultimately to impact human lives and human society. So she's actually at the forefront of this movement called AI for All, similar to kind of Tristan's point, really broadening who's in the room, who's contributing to these conversations. We think of the AI club as just for computer science students, but it shouldn't be. What her point is that we should have anthropologists and philosophers joining the AI club, people that are contributing to these conversations because they're deeply human conversations. So we get into this idea of not just what we're building, not just how we build it in the engineering department, but why we build things, right? And to kind of unpack another term of technology, big data, we have this notion that with more and more types of data, we've got sensors every which way, like in our clothes, in our buildings, in our cars, satellites that are launched for a couple $100 that collect data on every which way. And so some people have argued that could this be the end of the scientific method? If we have enough data, maybe we'll just get the answers, right? I don't know. So Chris Anderson, who runs TED, he used to be the editor of Wired. He wrote a great article in 2009 where sort of like Francis Fukuyama in political science wrote this great piece called The End of History. after the Cold War ended, Chris Anderson wrote this piece called The End of the Scientific Method. And in many ways, I'll unpack why, and I don't think this is true, and why we still need smart questioners. But basically, there's a company in the book I talk about called Kaggle. And Kaggle is a data science platform where anyone can release a data set. And the idea is you get people from all walks of life to ask questions of that data. So it really sort of broadens the scope. You don't just have accounting actuaries looking at actuarial data. You might have a glaciologist or somebody from a computer science background or anthropology. And so you're really kind of cutting through an issue from multiple directions and domains. And one of the earliest data sets that was posted on Kaggle, Kaggle was founded by an Australian economist who just liked big data. He was writing articles for The Economist magazine. He started going down the rabbit hole. And a few years later, he was running this big company, which actually sold to Google last year. And the early data sets that were posted, one of them was from NASA in the Royal Astronomical Society. And probably similar to what you guys talked about yesterday, this data set looked at the amount of dark matter in the universe, which is a real quandary. Cosmologists have been thinking about how to quantify black holes, how to quantify dark matter in the universe for a long time. And actually, they'd spent 10 years coming up with a number that they thought was a rough estimate. And they released the data set to Kaggle. And within 2 weeks, they actually had a glaciology student in the UK who was using his way of questioning when he looked at satellite images of glaciers. You obviously can't see the edges of the glaciers because the ice blends into the water. And so he was using that same approach to approach this question of dark matter. And he actually got closer to the approximation that NASA thought was the right approximation than it had taken them 10 years, and it took a glaciology student in the UK 2 weeks. And just kind of mind-shattering the growth you can achieve through sort of outside perspectives and different ways of questioning. And so, going back to Chris Anderson's End of the Scientific Method, actually, data, as much as we collect of it, it's not the same, as information, is not the same as knowledge, is not the same as wisdom. And actually, this is a concept that if you read Plato, he talks about this. And if you read Sir Francis Bacon, he also talks about this. It's kind of an age-old observation. And so, Voltaire in the 18th century has this statement where he basically says, you should judge a person by their questions, not by their answers. So even in this era of Google, where every answer is on the internet, all you have to do is pull it up on Google. Actually, the hardest thing about Google is when you sit there with the flashing cursor and you say, I have literally the world's information at my fingertips, and I have no idea what to ask it. And we've all been there at midnight, and you say, I don't know. And so there's a guy at NYU, Arun Sundararajan. He's got a really difficult last name to say for me. Arun has this notion of this perspective on Kaggle where it's basically the same thing as what happened with Roger Bannister. And Roger Bannister was the first person to break the 4-minute mile. So he was a runner. And at the time, everyone said it's impossible. Humans will never break the 4-minute mile until Roger Bannister did it. And then 72 days later, somebody else did it. And I think the same way that we think about, NASA said we've got 10 years of the smartest cosmologists in the world thinking about quantifying dark matter. We can't get any better than that. But they had the vision to post this to Kaggle. And just like 72 days later with Roger Bannister, 2 weeks later with Martin O'Leary, the glaciologist, he was able to break that record. And so, the moral of the story is it's not just data science. It's context. It's asking these questions from different angles. And I think that gets into where we sort of go around what jobs and opportunities there are for all of us. Because that's, one of the big questions of the day is we invest heavily in our educations. Sort of where does this all go? What are the skills that we should be learning? And there's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of data pointing to jobs going away, right? So a couple years ago, Oxford had this study where they said 47% of US jobs are at high risk of automation. Obviously, this set off a lot of alarm bells, and around the same time, Martin Ford came out with this great book called The Rise of the Robots, which I called this sort of the moment where all of the perspective, the pendulum swung toward fear, And I think that over the last couple years, we've gradually brought the pendulum back to a place of if not full hope, a place of at least moderation, of thinking that these are real technologies that are changing our world in real ways, but this is nothing new. This has always happened. And so more recently, McKinsey Global Institute has taken a more nuanced look at this issue of where is automation going to where does the rubber hit the road? In looking within 800 different jobs that are out there, what they did was they divided those jobs up into tasks, because every job is made up of lots of different little tasks. And some of those tasks are manual, and some of them are cognitive, and some of them are really routine. They're over and over and over, you do the same thing. And some of them are highly unpredictable, you've never done them before, they require flexibility and adaptability, and those are the non-routine tasks. And obviously, if we're talking about things that we do over and over again, with enough time and money and investment, we can automate those manual tasks, and that's in the form of robotics. Or if they're cognitive tasks and we do them over and over, like a rote calculation in Excel, we can obviously build a macro or use a formula, right? Those are extensions, kind of cognitive mind extensions that enable us to take a computer and have it do the routine thing for us. So it's really no different. And so they looked at, again, across these 800 occupations, and what they found was much more, flipping the letters from AI to IA, it was much more about the fact that some tasks within jobs will be routinized and will go to machine learning and robotics. But really, it's about 30% of the tasks within about 60% of the jobs that they looked at. And so that means the nature of jobs will change, but doesn't mean that jobs all go away, right? And so, where are the opportunities? And the opportunities are really in these non-routine tasks, right? They're in this sort of frontier of improvisation, of being creative, empathetic. If you look at the 4,000 stylists at Stitch Fix, what they're doing is on a day-to-day basis, they're interacting with clients. They're having conversations. They're being deeply empathetic, listening to those clients. They're collaborating with machines and with machine learning that's sorting these massive lists of characteristics of the specific millimeter width of a lapel, and very detailed things that people don't really care to deal with, right? And so the jobs of the future, I would argue, I think are about asking these right questions. They're about sort of interrogating ideas deeply. They're about training machines and training data. One of the things we often overlook when we talk about things like machine learning is that it's predominantly based on training data sets, which have to be pulled and codified and classified, and taxonomies have to be developed, questions have to be asked in order to just have the data to begin with to start doing the machine learning. So we sort of jump to conclusions, but we forget that there's a very, very human process in the beginning of that. So there's definitely a lot of work around training machines, training data, about challenging our own biases in the predictive policing example. What is this data set really showing, and what are the questions, and what are the ways we can fill the gaps or supplement this in different ways? And then being the front lines of empathy and communication. And so, this idea of how we train for adaptability or how we train for flexible skills, there are a bunch of different ideas. One of them, Louis Newman, who's one of the provosts at Stanford, he talks about treating our education more as a passport and less as a plane ticket. So we have this tendency to sort of generalize, and we say, well, I'm flying from here to anthropology, and you're flying from here to computer science. That destination is better than that destination. It's sort of this faux debate, because in reality, we've all got to have a plurality of these different skills and these different toolboxes. And so treating our education more as a passport, where we say, I've spent a lot of time in the humanities, I should take a data science class, I should take a computer science class. Or I've spent my entire career in the engineering department, public speaking scares me, I gotta go take a theater class. Like, I gotta get on stage, I gotta figure out how to break the ice in this domain that I haven't done before. And I think to the extent that you can think about your education in the next few years of school, in how do you fill out your full passport? I think that's a really good way of looking at how you develop the right skills. Because the jobs of the future, according to David Deming, he's an economist at Harvard, he talks about how it's not actually just technical skills. It's what he calls high math, high social is the fastest job growth. So we have a tendency to say, well, there's a skills gap. If you just learn JavaScript, you'll be fine. Actually, it's much more about high math, high social. So it's about breaking the ice and being able to engage with technology. That's for sure, part of the equation. But then the other part is all of these soft skills, all the social skills. And so I think that the high math, high social is another way of looking at it. And Google, Eric Schmidt talks about the one characteristic that basically every executive at Google has that's been successful, who's been successful. And he says it's a combination of persistence and curiosity. So again, it's about you're in this amazing academic institution. How can you find something that you're truly passionate about? Because it applies in many different ways to this whole technology-led world. Develop that sense of curiosity, that sense of persistence. Because at the end of the day, B.F. Skinner has this great line where he says, education is what survives when what you've learned has been forgotten. And anyone who's been out of school as long as I have, you'll know you don't remember a lot of the nitty-gritty of that one class, that one midterm, that one final. That stuff fades away. But it's the grit, the charisma, the passion, the curiosity. Those are the things that, I think as teachers, those are the things that you can instill into people in your class. As students, you'll remember those far more than you will the specifics of one class or another. In the end of the day, Tim Cook at MIT commencement last year, he said this, and he said, I'm not worried about artificial intelligence giving computers the ability to think like humans. I'm much more concerned with people thinking like computers without values and compassion. So, at the end of the day, I think technology is important. And certainly my life, coming from Silicon Valley, sitting in a venture capital role where my job has been to meet with lots of different entrepreneurs and companies, technology is certainly part of the equation. It's really changing our world, but these are the other pieces that if you listen to the Tim Cooks and the Steve Jobs and the Eric Schmidts and whoever else, they'll tell you that it's all of these well-rounded skills, the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. That's truly what it's at. So with that, thank you guys so much.
Time for questions.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question for you is, what do you think would be more important to focus on with AI or IA, like developing and growing? Should we be focusing on protecting the users from how and what is being created, or should we be more focused on controlling the people and how they use that technology?
That's a great question. I don't think I've ever gotten that before. I think you have to control the development in some ways of the technology. I think going back to that slide about technology is not agnostic on its own. You don't just release it and then say, well, people have used it in the wrong way. Actually, all of the menus, all of the choices, the ways that we frame things, back to some of those behavioral economics type examples, we can really nudge behavior in one direction or another. So I really think that that's the responsibility of the companies and the responsibility of creating a plurality of insights and perspectives on those teams. But at the same time, you also have to recognize that people will make mistakes, and so we have to have checks and balances probably against that. I was on a panel a few weeks back with Marissa Mayer, who was CEO of Yahoo and was running product at Google a while back. And she talked about the importance of building culture, as a leader, as a CEO, but also the reality that out of thousands of employees, if one person does something bad and the second person who's supposed to catch the mistake fails to catch the mistake, you can end up down these really hard roads. And one of the examples with Google was with Google Street View. So the cars that were driving around taking images, basically one engineer forgot to check a box that said, don't collect cookie data, and the code reviewer didn't see that that had happened. And fast forward a few months, they realized that some of the cars that were around taking images of streets were also passively picking up personal information of houses that they had driven by. And so, many, many lawsuits later, and obviously that engineer probably no longer works at Google, you can realize that there is a reality of mistakes and human error that are part of all of these things, but we've got to have the right checks and balances and leadership and culture in place. And we've seen that recently a lot with cultural issues at Facebook, moving fast and breaking things, or obviously at Uber, where the culture of a small startup extrapolated out to multi-thousand person company. Those cultural changes have to grow with the company. Yeah. Yes.
I'm familiar with Robert Oppenheimer and his fear after the tests in the desert of losing our humanity. That was foremost on his mind after that. And it is also foremost on Lauren Isley's mind, if you read into his writings. And I commend to everybody here the last chapter of Darwin's Century, the haunting quality of that writing with the chief concern about losing our humanity in relationship to the machines that surround us. And so the question to you is, what material, you've given us a lot of suggestions of reading, but what material is really essential in your mind for us to be looking at?
I think it's a great question. I think one of the examples I turn to, one of the frameworks I like thinking about these things from is having devices. We talk a lot about devices and technology. We forget about things, which are the things with really immutable properties that we can't just be entertained by. We have this infatuation with convenience and with being entertained. An iPhone can play music with a push of a button or connect us to somebody on the other side of the planet with the push of a button. But something like learning the guitar, learning to play an instrument, those are things with deep kind of immutable properties where you can play music in 5 seconds on your iPhone, you can play music in 5 years on a guitar, right? And one of them takes patience and persistence. And so I think balancing in how we raise kids and how we think about teaching both devices and engaging with technology, but not forgetting about things that really require patience and mastery. I've liked that framework of thinking about this issue. But the other is, I mentioned Quora earlier, and Quora is a question and answer website that's used a lot around technology issues, used a lot in Silicon Valley. And I had a laugh recently because somebody said, how do I learn empathy? How do I learn soft skills? On Quora, they posted this question. And somebody wrote an answer, and the answer was, you got to read books about empathy. And I like did facepalm. That's not how you learn about empathy. You got to travel the world, read some literature from 200 years ago, put yourself into another culture, get in the back of a taxi and talk to people, get to know other people from different walks of life. And that's how you can sort of engage with humanity. And I think sometimes we have this very linear, very tech-centric approach to problem solving because we're so focused looking down at our smartphones and not looking up at the world. But these are very real questions that I don't have good answers to, but I think posing the question is the right first step.
So I believe it was Descartes who first suggested that the mind and mental reality exist apart from the physical. But we were able to reconcile that using quantum physics and the wave-particle duality. Do you think in a similar fashion technology can help communicate with the humanities?
Wow. Well, so I was not a scholarship recipient, so first and foremost, hats off for the good question. That's. Does anyone else have a thought? I do think that we're going to listen to a presentation coming up next. There are very real ways that we're able to take our humanity and I think put it into technology in different ways. But at the same time, I think that the processes of creativity and of consciousness, and these are things that we still haven't figured out in the natural sciences. So figuring them out in the engineering sciences and ways to replicate them, I think we're still a far ways off. We talk a lot about AI. If you look at something like Google's DeepMind, which created AlphaGo program, which defeated the world champion Go player, which is an ancient Chinese game of Go, which is immensely complex. Or actually, I would say, I don't know if it's complex or complicated. I tend to think complicated is a rules-based process where even with 1,000 rules, it can be very, very complicated, but maybe not complex. So there are challenges between, is AI really solving complex challenges, or probabilistically, is it just solving complicated challenges? It's certainly still very context dependent. So if you talk to any of the engineers from DeepMind, they'll tell you this is an immense step forward in AI, but it's still on the context of a board that's a certain number of squares by a certain number of squares. So we're not generalizing that AI quite yet. So I think we're still a long way off of really seeing our humanity in our technology. I think we're still trying to mimic certain small corners of our humanity on very specific contexts.
I want to know what happened when you ran into Ray Kurzweil at Google. So, in other words, do you believe in the singularity? Do you think that man can transcend his own biology?
So the interesting thing, from my pragmatic seat now in venture capital, is you can be right, but if you're right at the wrong time, you're wrong. And so the key thing with technology is, will something happen? Potentially. I cannot argue with his logic. The same way that 5-6 years ago, everyone on Sand Hill Road, which is the big thoroughfare of VC firms, they said this thing called near field communication is imminent. NFC is going to happen. And what that means is you're going to walk into your store, you're going to put things in your purse, and you're just going to walk out. And it's going to auto charge your card. NFC, this is a fait accompli, it's going to happen. Meanwhile, there was a guy named Jack Dorsey who created Square, which was an iPad to swipe pieces of plastic. And meanwhile, he built a $20 billion company. Everyone was focusing on NFC, which still hasn't happened. Amazon is starting to get at the corners of that with their, very specific, with their Amazon stores. But so that would be my response, is that he could be teleologically the end state of all things. Like, is he logically correct? Maybe. Does it matter? I don't think so. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I like how you talked about high tech skills and high social skills are kind of the way of the future for careers and professions. There has been a lot of research done that younger generations are having more and more trouble with social skills and human interaction. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that with the evolution of careers.
Yeah, there's probably a video game that can teach human interaction, or a virtual reality world where we'll deal with virtual avatars to teach real-world skills. I'm sure there's a really complicated solution to the problem, but there's also probably a really simple one, which is go talk to people. But it's a really good question. Kara Swisher, who's a journalist focusing on a lot of Silicon Valley stuff, she has this quip about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and that it's assisted living for millennials, because what they're doing is they're creating all these companies that just replicate the services that their mothers once did for them. So, there's like car delivery, food delivery, grocery delivery, laundry delivery. And so the bigger question, I think, and the challenge for all of you guys is, as future entrepreneurs, can you zoom out and really try to address some of the fundamental human problems writ large across the world? Not just laundry delivery, not just better communication through sharing a photo this way or that way, or with bunny ears or dog ears. I mean, these are fun things, and I don't want to belittle them, but I think that these are also some of the fundamental challenges that future entrepreneurs could be thinking about, not just in, to my joke, building virtual reality worlds to teach soft skills, but how do we address some of these big questions in education? Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks again. And for this last advice, you can come learn that in the College of Humanities. So just thought I would say that again. We're going to take, as we prepare for the next presentation, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. If you need to use the bathroom, it's on this side. And I just want to remind everybody that Scott's book, The Fuzzy and the Tucky, will be available for sale and signing after the end of the second presentation that is about to start. So I'll remind you about this later. Thank you.
It's on.
Right
It's
and
ready to
left.
go.
Great, thank you.
We are about to start soon. Please return to your seats.
And I point this where exactly? Where do I point this? I'm pointing this to my computer, right?
What's that?
The clicker is being pointed to my computer.
Yeah, that clicker is
Okay.
done on, so that's working with it.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, we are back for the second speaker today for this series, Cathy Kuhn. Cathy Kuhn is a performer, choreographer, and technologist based in Brooklyn, New York. She's a 2018 TED resident. A native Californian, she graduated with high honors from UC Berkeley and was a visiting student at the University of Oxford. She has performed with the Metropolitan Opera Ballet and the Lyric Opera of Chicago, among many others. In addition to her performing career, her passion for technology is evidenced by her previous work experience at Google, YouTube, and Bain & Company. She was vice president at Color and Information, a digital and video agency in Brooklyn, New York, and is currently the digital expert at Gaynor Minden, where she oversees the website redesign, creates video content, and manages digital marketing programs. She has previously presented on emerging VR and AR technologies at Brown University and the Dance New York Conference. She is currently collaborating with Amy Laviers, Assistant Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Illinois and Director of the Robotics, Automation, and Dance Lab. Their piece, entitled Time to Compile, was shown at Connecticut College in February, Brown University in March, Georgia Tech in April, and will show at the CODEM San Francisco in June of 2018. Ms. Kuhn is now a research technician at the RAD lab through this work. The title of our lecture today is Dancing Robots, Choreographing Humans and Machines. Please welcome Cathy Kuhn.
Hi, everyone. It's a great group. I'm really excited to be here. I want to say thank you to the university for the invitation. Very excited to meet all of our Durant scholars. You're already on an incredible path to success. And I want to thank my fellow speakers, Scott and Tyler, and especially if anyone was here for Andra's talk yesterday, I think that was a wonderful context for some of the themes I'm going to be exploring. So I'm very excited. Appreciate the biological introduction. I want to pose a question for you to hold in the back of your mind for the duration of this talk. And that is, what exists outside of the realm of question and answer? What is orthogonal to the binary of question and answer? And that's really where my work sits. So a lot of what I do is at the intersection of mechanical engineering, psychology, choreography, and storytelling. And I hope that it will provide a little bit of an introduction into how humanity comes into this field of technology, robotics, machine learning, as I'm sure I'll dictate today. So I want to start really briefly with an idea. So much of what you think and know and feel about robots is comprised of how you see them through story. And whether that story is movies or the media or a book that you've read, there's quite a bit of research that shows that pop culture has so much to do with your perception of new technologies. So is this a familiar face, right? Pretty familiar. We actually saw this in Andra's talk. This is an iteration of a robot a couple of decades ago, one that's slightly more recent, right? This is something that we heard Scott talk a little bit about. This is Black Mirror. This was inspired by Boston Dynamics Spot Mini robot. Yeah, it's coming to kill you. That's the name of the story. And this is from Westworld, right? So we have these highly capable, sentient, we've exported consciousness, we've turned it into some sort of computer program, and we've put it into an embodiment of a human being, right? So this is IMDb's top 35 highest grossing movies about robots. 80% of those movies depict robots in a very violent fashion, yeah? This is highly problematic because it comes down and then percolates into the fear that you have about your daily life. I think Scott teed this up really nicely in saying that we had this swing of the pendulum towards fear. I'm actually going to show you some data points that we haven't quite recovered from that fear yet, right? 75% of Americans are afraid of robots. There was a Chapman University study in 2015. More Americans are afraid of robots than they are of death. That's a big, big problem, right? I can just say that statistic and you already know why that's an issue. Because so many roboticists, the goals that we have for robots are really to improve people's lives. And it's so hard to interface with a human being if they're entirely afraid, right? So it's not just the movies. The media is not doing much better. This is the Spot Mini. Again, we had this video that came out on YouTube, and everyone was in a big hoopla. Vice Media, The Guardian, Mashable, they were all saying these robots can open doors. They're going to come open your door in your bedroom in the middle of the night, and life will end as we know it. Same goes for Vice, right? Huge problem. And the reason why this is an issue, fear is normal, first of all. Every new technology introduces some type of fear. When movies first came out, there was a big speeding train. That was one of the first scenes in a movie, and people fell out of their seats. They were so terrified, they thought that a train was going to come out and just hit them square in the forehead. It's not actually what happens, yeah? So fear is totally normal. The problem with when we divert from fear immediately into violence, conflict between human beings is inevitable. Violence is a choice. Conflict is inevitable, violence is a choice. And fear is not only dangerous, it can also be completely untrue, right? We don't see the full context of what's happening here. You know, there's someone standing behind that robot with a remote control, yeah? They don't include that in the video. It's been this highly doctored, beautifully oriented video to make you feel a certain way. Yeah, Andrew kind of referred to this similarly in her talk yesterday. And when people are afraid, StoryCorps founder Dave Isay had a great quote where he said, "Fear inhibits action." If I'm afraid, I don't participate, right? I don't bring my skills to the field. I don't provide the contributions that I'm capable of bringing. And the future becomes less inclusive when we all sit back and decide that we're afraid. Who benefits from you being scared? It's another question I want you to think about. So we have this opportunity. There's actually an enormous opportunity to provide positive renditions of robots, positive narratives about what robots can do, and also to put them in a context where we can see what they actually are capable of, right? The perfect example that we had of AlphaGo, AlphaGo can't give you a hug. It doesn't speak Japanese. It doesn't learn how to tie its shoes, right? It's been created to do something very specific. And when we imbibe this particular technology with so much grandeur, highly, highly problematic. We become inferior in relationship to the robot when we do that. So why do I care about this, I think is the big question. I had a long introduction with some of the things that I've done in my life, and why do I care about this particular issue, right? These are some of the robots that might appear in your home. Some of them look fairly familiar. And they're being designed to do lots of different things, right? They're meant to engage with you sociologically. They're meant to hear your voice. They travel around your house, right? And people have various feelings when it comes to these machines. Some people are totally alienated. Some people are totally involved. We've seen all the memes with cats on Roombas, right, of them scrolling around your house. And so some people feel like they're imbuing character into this machine. And I know quite a few people who are very near and dear to me in my life who have felt completely alienated by technology. My dad is a great example. So when he was sick a couple years ago, he spent a long time in the hospital, and he was surrounded by heart monitors, fall detectors, breathing machines, right? These things are supposed to make him feel safe and healthy. And he felt totally alienated and afraid of them. And it was an awful thing to watch, right? Because the heart monitor shouldn't only be a heart monitor. It can make him feel secure and healthy. So my work asks the question, what can robots do? But much more importantly, how do we feel about it? Function and expression. So I think about how robots move, right? I'm a choreographer. I have a long dance background. And I think about the movement of robots and how that affects our feelings. A lot of communication is nonverbal. Actually, I would argue all communication is nonverbal, right? Because even to talk, I have to also be moving at the same time. So perhaps the correct way of posing that is that kinetics have to do with communication. So all of my work is concerned with this intersection of how do robots move and what are the stories that we tell about them. So I want to share a little bit about my experience of being the artist in residence and a research technician at the Robotics, Automation, and Dance Lab. And in the title of the Rad Lab is the word dance. It's a very human thing, right? And it's in a mechanical engineering department at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where they invented the transistor. Yeah, so this is like a dance lab with robots in Illinois. It's pretty incredible stuff. And Amy LaVeers is the director of this lab. And through the Rad Lab, we've been exploring some of these questions of how do robots make us feel? What types of stories can we tell about robots? How are human beings going to exist in the world and retain much of our humanity in relationship to these machines? And it turns out that roboticists and artists have been working together for a very long time. You could even say Da Vinci was one of them, right? This is Bot and Dolly. This was a piece that was done between the San Francisco Ballet and this sort of elevated, broad-reaching drone robotic arm. This is a piece that Amy LaVeers worked on in her PhD. It's called Automata. And what it has to do with is this particular noun looking at stylization of movement. Yeah, and then this is a piece that was by Ken Goldberg, Martin Wattenberg, and a few other folks called Bloom. And so roboticists and engineers, or roboticists and artists have been working together for a long time, probing some of these questions. It's a very rich intersection. And in fact, we started and we embarked on this journey called Time to Compile. So I've been working with the Rad Lab now for about a year. And this is Amy, if you can see, and Ashan, and this is his 360 camera, and this is a 360 view of the Rad Lab, right? So we've been working together on this piece called Time to Compile. And it's not only a performance, as you'll soon see, it is a very rich NSF-sponsored research project of thinking about how we can bring some of these questions to the fore of human, robot, and interaction. So I get to the Rad Lab, it's like June of last year. I've never been to Illinois. And I'm coming down on this plane, cornfields everywhere. I'm from Brooklyn, or I live in Brooklyn. I grew up in the Bay Area. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? What conceivable value does a dancer choreographer have to bring? I mean, I have a programming background, right? We've heard about some of the tech companies where I worked. But what conceivable value does a dancer choreographer have to bring to this robotics lab, right? So I'm feeling a lot of insecurity. I'm not really sure where I'm going to start. And the first thing that I came up with was this idea of I want to create relationship, right? So relationship between human beings, as we've so heard beautifully from Scott, is a very muddy space, yeah? And I think relationships between humans and robots are even muddier. So the first thing that I did with this robot was literally put my cheek against the screen. Very simple, right? I thought about what does it feel like to do that? What does it feel like to look at this giant manufacturing robot? It's 6 feet high, it's super loud, it's $30,000. It's mostly used for research and manufacturing. What can I do to be powerful in relationship to this robot? And I just went and stood next to it and just put my cheek there and tried to see what that felt like. Turns out it feels like I am very human and this machine is very unhuman, right? Seeing it from afar, maybe you're thinking, oh my God, that machine looks so personal. No, 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 no. Going up, putting your cheek against the screen of a robot. It's this sensation that I am so clearly breathing and vivacious and dynamic compared to this very static, discrete, functionally operational machine. And it totally made me think, oh my gosh, I'm awesome. This robot is capable of such a tiny, tiny slice of what we are capable of, right? So I've been working with dancers for a very long time, and we have these incredible modes of expressivity. We can learn so quickly. I mean, not only dancers, I think humans in general, right? We can learn so quickly. We are capable of articulating so much. We are on the order of magnitudes. I mean, Amy's done quite a bit of work on this expressivity index, but we're on the order of trillions and trillions and trillions, magnitudes of complexity. Robots right now are like a C. elegans, which is a worm the size of a comma, right? We are so dynamic when compared to these very static, discrete machines. And people need to recognize that, because otherwise we wind up into these deep, dark narratives of everything is coming to destroy me. So I learned how to program this robot, and the first thing that I felt was I'm really not scared of any of these, right? Fear is not the only option when it comes to robots. And believe it or not, I was having a discussion with Amy about this. Because this robot is mostly used for manufacturing and research, I think it is likely that I'm the only person that's ever put my cheek to it. I mean, that might be real. It's very highly likely. But this is me programming the robot. This is my first week in the Rad Lab. So and thinking about how do I create relationships with these machines? How do I become relevant in this context? And the next thing I did was start to work with this small robot called the Now. Some of you might have seen this. This is a robot that's Aldebaran, which is a French company, and then got bought by SoftBank. And I started to think about, if I mirror the movements of this robot, does that create implicit relationship? Right? So now we have two different types of relationship. One, which is proximity. Second different type of relationship, which is movement mirroring. Yeah? So I'm thinking about, how is this affecting me emotionally? Am I feeling closer to these robots? Am I feeling farther away? Am I feeling more human, less human? What's going on here? And this idea that somehow mirroring the movement of a robot would make me feel something, I think is very relevant, because people, anytime you're engaging with a new piece of technology, you are adapting to that technology. You are becoming more discrete in order to be able to use it, right? I don't really like typing like this. What if I could type like this, right? I don't really like hitting my smartphone like this. I kind of look like a dinosaur. What if when I made a phone call, I said, Siri, please call Mary Stapleton Mobile? Right? It would be a totally different life experience than if I go through my whole existence cowed over, head down, neck forward. Every single time I'm interfacing with a new piece of technology, I am adapting how I function in order to suit the needs of that particular interface. I think a lot about the ethics of what that is, right? Who designed this? Why do I have to move and work the way that they want me to? This menu of choices? Yeah? Who's a part of determining those answers? So the next thing I did is I thought about, what if I could create implicit relationship just through this idea of intimacy, right? So now we have three types of relationship. We have one, which is proximity, the second one, which is mirroring, and the third one, which is like replication of societal norms. Yeah? And so I pick up this Now robot, which, believe it or not, everyone thinks this robot is very cute. I think it is too. I pick up this Now robot, and I wrap myself in the arms of Dexter, and suddenly this becomes very familiar, right? Who's still scared of the robot? Same goes for here. If I touch my hand to something, if I get down to the level of the robot, does that still make this robot kind of like this incredibly sentient, capable, amazing thing? Not really, right? And this storytelling made its way into not only the piece of Time to Compile, but also the work that I started to do with the Rad Lab students. So there are, I think in the realm of about 12 students, from undergrads all the way up till PhD students, who are working in the robotics, automation, and dance lab. And I decided, well, I worked with Amy, and we really created sort of a plan for this, that we were going to teach movement class to these engineers 4 days a week for a month. And this is what it looked like. A lot of you are probably still asking the question, like, why is movement class relevant for engineers? Like, what is that about? I totally don't get it. It's really weird. This is a task where one of them had to act like a broom. And they both chose these kind of different renditions of what a broom would look like, right? Some people were standing, some people were on the floor. And it's because if they're going to be designing control systems and robots that are supposed to interface with human beings, they need to understand the humanity of themselves. I cannot underscore that enough. If we're going to have a movement vocabulary to be able to build robots that are skimming through your house or picking you up out of a nursing home and taking you somewhere to use the bathroom, we need to have a shared lexicon, a shared vocabulary that brings together these fields of dance and engineering, right? You say non-determined, I say improvisation. Same thing. We're just using different ways to talk about it. And so we're thinking about some of this frustration. I'm teaching these movement classes. This is still my first couple weeks in the Rad Lab. And I'm like, we have to make a piece, right? We have to make an art piece. It's called Time to Compile. And some of these major themes start to emerge, the first one of which is this idea of, are humans becoming more robot-like, or are robots becoming more human-like? So I initially posed this question of, are robots becoming more human-like? And Amy was like, oh my God, you're crazy. Robots are going to take so long. They have like joint angles and sensors and computers and all these things that need to be hardwired and put together. And it's going to be a long time before they become really human-like. We, on the other hand, adapt, change, and mold ourselves as quickly as we possibly want to be able to use the next application, right? So it's the same idea of basically, are we imbibing humanity into machines, or are humans imbibing machine-like qualities into us? And this second piece starts to emerge, which is that this hidden human network, right? A perfect example is this IBM Watson. They put him in commercials and elevators, and it's got this totally human voice, and it's providing all of this descriptive information. And at the same time, it's just a bunch of algorithms that have been written by people with a couple of animations, right? Watson is not sentient. Watson doesn't have feelings. To my Descartes question, Searle is a great person for you to read. Where did she go? Yes. So we need to deface this idea that machines are this totally magical, omnipresent, highly capable entities, yeah? And recognize what really is driving some of these things. And then this third theme starts to emerge, which is the idea of time to compile. So if I create a dance right now on a human being, and I decide that this is my dance, it just compiled, right? I just did it for you. You all saw it. Here's a dance. It's so hard to do that with a robot. It takes forever to choreograph a robot. Anytime I get in front of a computer, anytime I grab one, anytime I move around with something, it takes forever for that robot to stop being error prone. So we have this mass discrepancy between what humans can do and what robots can do in different periods of time. So we have these three themes, and we start to take this piece all over, right? We're going to Brown, we're going to Connecticut College, we have these big invitations to be in Toronto and Italy and different places in the next few months. And at the same time, we're thinking, this is all well and good. We love showing different pieces to audiences. But at the end of the day, we want to understand how this is really changing your minds, right? I opened with this big thing about narrative and how important story is in dictating the way that we feel and act. So we want to know at the end of the day, like, how is this actually affecting people? So there's this question of, can we create a Turing test for a moving audience participant? So if I asked one of you to come up and move around with a robot, would you know if the robot is being controlled by a human being on the other end or by an algorithm, which, per my conclusion earlier, is also a human being but is an algorithm? So we have this idea of, can we create a Turing test for a live embodied audience participant as a way of learning how you think and feel about robots and how those thoughts and feelings can be changed. And we created this thing called the loop. This is Eric in the middle. It's so dark. I don't know if you guys can really see him, but the Baxter robot is moving around, and Eric is standing in front of it, and all we said to Eric was mirror the movements of the robot, right? So Eric starts moving around, he's mirroring the movements of the robot, and I am very surreptitiously standing behind him, moving around in a motion capture suit, right? So I'm copying what Eric's doing, Eric is copying what the robot is doing. Is the robot being controlled by a human or by an algorithm? We don't know. Same goes for Umer, who's in VR right now. Umer is seeing a VR avatar, and he's mirroring the movements of the avatar, right? So we're giving Umer an embodied movement task, and he's mirroring the movements of the avatar. And then this is Ashan, who's sitting behind everyone, making sure that it all still runs. So what was interesting about this? What did we learn from this? Basically what we did is we interconnected every output and every input such that we had this gigantic loop of moving people. So here's Eric dancing around in front of the Baxter. Here's me behind him. My motion is being extrapolated, put into Umer's glasses. Umer is watching it. Umer's motion is being extrapolated, put into the Baxter. And so we have this big, long, moving loop of human beings and robots all doing the same movement at the same time. What's a real-world example of that? Skype? The internet? Anytime you text someone, right? We all have this movement engagement that is mediated by machines. And so this is what we wound up creating as sort of an embodied performative installation. And of course, it got a little complicated. This is just an idea of what that three-pronged loop looks like. This could theoretically, in our perfect version, be 9, 10, 12 versions long, and we would have this giant circle of moving machines and bodies that are all completely interconnected. This is a very demo type video of what that looked like in rehearsal. So this is, you can't really see this one as well, but that's Cameron following the robot, me following behind Cameron, Ashan, who's way back there in VR. I think it's too dark to be able to see. And then the robot obviously moving as a result. So we wind up with this very broad, long movement trajectory. And this thing that we call the loop. So We took this all over, too. We've taken this to a couple of different places. And the question that we always ask people is, how does this change your mind about humans and about robots? And why does this art piece matter for the field of robotics, right? Someone's bringing me to Illinois. Someone's paying for me to be there. Someone's taking us to all of these different places. The economics are real. And the research value that we've started to come up with is kind of multi-pronged. So time to compile is simultaneously art, commercialization, and research. This is Alex. She's doing an embodied movement exercise with a Now robot. And we provide the robot in a few different shapes and forms, right? We put it in a two-dimensional form, very big, put it in a two-dimensional form, very small, and then actually have it in front of her. And we see how size affects her feeling and perception about the robot. So this is a user study that's being run through an NSF, or will be run, through an NSF grant, which is trying to understand how we will perceive robots in our homes, right? So there's tremendous research value. We literally exported this directly from the loop and turned it into a research study. This is me sort of providing a live demo of what this looks like. And some people might still have the question in the back of your mind, so what does this have to do with research? Art is about making experiences for audiences. Research is about measuring experience. If we are going to understand how people feel about robots, we need to be able to create experiences that are as rich as the ones that they have seen in the movies and on the news. So the research studies that I make and that we design at the Rad Lab have this in the back of our minds. This is another research study that we did. It's measuring power, valence, and acceptability. So we put some of these binaries up. That's Sean in the upper right corner and Amy in the upper left. Amy's the director of the Rad Lab, and Sean's a graduate student. We put some of these binaries up for people, and we asked them, what seems more positive? What seems more powerful? What would you rather have in your house? And then we asked them the same question after the show. And we asked them the same question after they stand up and do an embodied movement exercise with these robots. How do you think some of these parameters change? Right? Narrative has so much to do with your perception of new technology, and it is such an important skill in terms of bringing humanities very tangibly into the STEM fields. Right? Out of all these user studies, we started to come up with this idea of creating a robot that was much more expressive, inspired by some of these ideas around character, bilateral symmetry, right? And we are in the throes of thinking about commercializing this. So we have this big grant from the NSF where we're going to travel all over and do customer interviews and see if people would be interested in a different type of robot. Yeah, so time to compile winds up being three big things: art, research, and product, commercialization. And all of those things are completely interrelated, right? Like, this is what a lot of our experience looks like with machines. And it doesn't always have to be this way. If we can explore some of these topics from a totally different point of view. And I want to end really briefly on kind of a personal story as to how we got here, or at least for me, how I got here. And inspiring you to think about some of the skills that you have and the experiences that you can bring to fields as your onlyness, right? So I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Berkeley, California. In the midst of the tech boom, I got my first computer when I was 9 years old. It was an e-machine computer. I don't know if any of you know what an e-machine is. It got absorbed. Oh, am I off? Oh, thanks. An e-machine computer. You can actually just, yeah. Thanks. I got it when I was 9 years old. It was absorbed by Dell. Yeah, it was like one of the early kind of, and I loved this computer. Like, I learned how to play Minesweeper on it and do AOL chat. And I felt really invigorated by the idea that I could affect the world and communicate with other people through technology. And then I felt totally alienated about the idea that I could be a programmer. Because culturally, when you looked in the news and on TV and in the media what those people looked like, none of them looked like me, right? I'm like goofy, loud. My dad's from Cuba. My mom's from upstate New York. Like, I am not what programmers are supposed to be, right? So I created this narrative of my head that I could never be a part of science and engineering. Yeah, and it stayed that way for a long time until I got to college, and I was like, well, my mom studied business, and I love to dance, so I'm going to study business and dance. Just sort of happened, right? Like you have these experiences that just take you from one step to the next. And I'm in college, and I'm studying business and dance, and I'm still like, but I want to be working with technology. I want to be doing all of the exciting cutting-edge things that people are doing in Silicon Valley. And I had been telling myself this defeatist narrative, this story about who I could be and what I could do in the world that existed from nowhere. It just existed from the movies and the media and the news and all the things that I had seen that told me I couldn't do that. Not true. And so I started interning at some of these tech companies. I really tried to insert myself in that universe. And I moved to New York City with a very hardcore full-time job working at Bain & Company as a management consultant, right? And I knew in the back of my mind that was never going to be my real life. But it is so hard to be brave when all you ever see are things that are not what you look like and what you are trying to do in the world, right? And I quit that job, and I just started dancing full-time. And I knew that there would be some sort of universe where I could bring all of this stuff together, where I could bring my desire for making empathetic, ethical technologies and my desire for being creative and expressive and dynamic and being a dancer, and where I could bring my desire of working with young people and working with, you know, humans who are sitting at this edge of creating new technology. And I knew that that could happen at some point. But if you don't know what it looks like, it's really hard to be brave, right? And when I wound up coming to the Rad Lab, I felt that it was this conglomerate of people who totally understood the value in engineering and science and the value in something like art and dance. And I decided, not only then, but a couple points before that, that fear never was going to be my path, right? Fear, all it does is it encourages exclusivity. It maintains the status quo. It means that you'll never get to be a part of the things you want to be a part of. And so if I have a take-home message, it really is the desire and the chutzpah and the strength that you need to be brave. Everybody has it, right? It's just a matter of how you choose to express that bravery. And I think when we talk about humanities and engineering and innovation, as Scott put so beautifully, it really is so much of the same thing. You have a vision and a goal for what you want the world to look like. And you take steps towards making that goal appear. Whether you do it through a dance, whether you do it through an algorithm, whether it's a novel or a machine, you're all contributing to some semblance of the future. And so I want to encourage, especially my scholarship folks, to think about what are the stories that you tell yourself of what you can and cannot do. Where did you hear those stories? Where did they come from? Did they come from the 80% of the terrifying robot movies that you've seen before? From the 72% of the Google top 50 searches on robots that are all violent robots? Where did they come from? Where did you learn what was and wasn't okay? Where did you learn that it wasn't valid to be a dancer in a robotics lab? Why did I feel that insecurity? Where did that come from? Right? Because all it does is preserve very particular hierarchies about how the world functions. And the whole point of being in university, and I think learning new things, is to expose yourself to what else possibly exists. So this fall, I'm going to be a PhD student at Stanford in mechanical engineering. And I come from a business and dance background, right? But stories that we tell about robots are a part of robotics. Feelings that humans have about robots are a part of robotics. It's human-robot interaction. It's all the same thing. So if I can say one last note here, it's that inclusion is not only a buzzword. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of bravery, and it takes a lot of people bringing whatever skills, experience, and goals and visions that they have to the table. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. That was fantastic. Listening to your talk and the talks earlier today and yesterday, one and the focus on storytelling and challenging ourselves for experiences left me with the following question. What role do you see for people who are not students anymore, people who are mid-career, in the twilight of their career, moving on to different challenges? You know, we haven't grown up in the tech world, but many of us are very comfortable in it. We've had experiences, we have stories to tell, we've had challenges and questioned things that we were told we could or couldn't do. In addition to the wonderful students who are here today embarking upon their careers, what role do you see the rest of the community playing in this tech and humanities world?
Thank you so much for your question. This is something I think about a lot because both coming from the background that I come from with my 3 parents who are very much, I would say, tech literate to a degree, right? So they have a good understanding of how to use their phones and email and that sort of thing. But they're also feeling kind of alienated by a lot of these devices, and they don't necessarily know what type of insight they can offer. I think a few things. So some of the authors that I've read in this field that don't necessarily have a tech literate background, like an E.O. Wilson, for example, sort of look at the lens of whatever it is they do through the broader historical context of how technology exists in society. Yeah, so one example I can think of is a good friend of mine who's based out of Brown. His name's Peter Haas, and he was a person who came from a statistics background. He came at the field of computation and engineering as a total outsider, and he said, I just have some curiosities. I have some things that I want to read about, right? And started to become involved at sort of like a very surface level, and then started writing to people whose work that he thought was interesting. I think that's something that I sort of recommend for anyone who's interested in being a part of the tech and humanities literacy community. I actually wrote, after the election in 2016, to a lot of political scientists because I wanted to more accurately understand what had happened. Yeah, I mean, please, I don't need to apologize for my politics. I grew up in Berkeley. I live in Brooklyn. I feel like it's pretty obvious, pretty obvious where I sit on the line. But I felt very alienated, right? I felt very alienated from the political landscape, and I just started writing to a bunch of professors and people who were intellectual leaders in the field, and I said, I'd like to understand what you think happened, and they all wrote me back. So something that I say to my dad just sent me an email the other day, and he was like, what if artificial intelligence isn't to replace the human brain, but it's to supplement the human brain? I said, Dad, this is great. You should write to a bunch of professors who are in AI and just tell them your thoughts. They'll all listen to you. I mean, I think people are really thrilled to know that you're being engaged in their work, right? That's one suggestion I guess I could make. I think the second one is to try to gather as much information as possible that doesn't only come from certain sources. Something that's really frustrating to me is I feel like Twitter, social media, everything's very myopic. International news outlets write about these things in a very different way than US news outlets do. I mean, Japan, England, China, the Netherlands, they all have very different perceptions of robots than what we read about in the news. I think that's something that has been tremendously valuable to me. And then I also feel like there's this idea, and Andra sort of touched on this beautifully, of like ageism in technology, which I find also really silly and frustrating because I actually think most of the wisdom sits at the farther end of the age spectrum. I think so many people in my generation lack emotional intelligence, sort of lack ethics and morals. I mean, again, grew up in the Bay Area. I see a lot of tech company CEOs who, I don't mean to vilify them in any way, I think are lacking tremendously in understanding my worldview, for example. And I'm probably about the same age as they are. Yeah, so I think that there's sort of this prevailing idea of ageism in technology, which I find really awful. And if it's not, I want to go start a new career in technology, I think there's something to be said about either writing to academics or speaking publicly about some of your sentiments and just saying that, hi, I'm a person who lives in this place and this is sort of my outlook and I want to be able to share it with people because I think we've become so myopic about what some of these systems and people are. It's a very long-winded answer, which I don't know was very helpful to you. But I think I really encourage people to start voicing whatever alt opinions might exist, because otherwise we have one stream of consciousness, and that's not how humans are.
You are my dream come true. One of the things that I would hope a robot can do is learn the 108 Tai Chi moves so that I can follow him or her around and finally learn them and put them together. Because I've been studying this for many years and I still can't do the whole thing. So that would be one thing that you're combining is choreography and technology. How far is that dream of mine from achievement?
I'm going to repeat your question to you because I just want to make sure we're on the same page. You've been studying Tai Chi for quite a long time?
Yeah, and there are 108 moves, not all unique. There are, I think, 66 unique moves in the Tai Chi, in the practice that I use, which is Taoist Tai Chi. And I go to a class, there is a teacher, and we follow him. Without him, there's no way we would know how to do it. And so I would like a robot that knows, learns how to do this. And then, because this is a practice that we're supposed to do every day, at least once. And it's great for health, particularly people my age. It's really very helpful. And it would be great if that were available.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I love that. And I have to say also, I love that you're thinking about doing Tai Chi with a robot, because I think half the time when I tell people I dance with robots, they're like, oh, that's so weird. And I'm like, I actually really love doing it because I love the idea of constraint and that the robot can only move in a certain way. And usually choreographically, like, you have more possibilities than you can handle. So I think Andra had really beautifully that slide of sort of showing maturity and where we are in the scope of robotics. I don't know if I have a great time horizon of when a Tai Chi robot will appear, but I think that Baxter, which has now been around for I think 6 or 7 years, robots like that are easily programmable by holding them and moving them should start to become more widely available. My guess would be in maybe the next 3 or 5. I also think that you could create a video of yourself and guide yourself and do a little duet between the two of you, doing Tai Chi anytime you so choose. And I wonder if, whether it's a robot or not, I'm curious to know if you would care about how big or small it is. Uh-huh. No, the reason I'm asking is because this is completely fascinating to me, right? That the idea of like having this with doing Tai Chi with a robot rather than with a screen or a video of yourself or a friend is, and maybe because it's 3D and it's an actuated body, yeah. That will be our next commercialization avenue. Tai Chi robot.
Now, something that's critical to humans and their evolution was the relationships that they had with animals through the course of their history, and how we co-evolved and started to grow together. So part of me is curious, do you ever see like a future where we can see robots get to like such a normalized and natural state and so standardized in our lives that we could potentially like co-evolve with them? Or do you think that their synthetic and like abiotic nature will continue to, I guess, like inhibit that?
Yeah, great question. So my next residency that starts at the end of TED is a ThoughtWorks Arts residency, and they have worked with a group called the Cyborg Foundation. And you might want to look them up. They install sensors inside of their bodies, right, to try to create synesthesia. There's another woman who installed a sensor in her foot so that she can feel earthquake tremors more readily inside of her body, even if they're not detectable. So I think there's certainly like a little bit of symbiosis from an artistic or philosophical point of view that's already happening, right, if you so choose. For me, the question is not so much like, are we going to co-evolve? Robots don't come into existence without human beings. Humans make robots, right? So if we want a robot that can do or perform a certain function, I think that that's completely feasible in the near future. I would like to see research studies, anyone who's working within the mechanical engineering field, that basically says that a robot will then decide how to create oneself and imbue certain functions within the robot, which I would then deem to be truly evolution, right? Something that happens sort of by natural progression. But I don't necessarily, are you imagining some sort of like superhuman singularity robot race that's combined of these two entities?
No, I'm just thinking like how, like if there's a point where our reliance on robots, if they do reach like that really like high quality state, would have an effect on our evolution and like our dependency.
Have an effect on our, well, I think this is great because you're telling a story about the future, right? And future stories about the future are going to be inherently high, how would I say this? Because we don't know what they are yet, and we haven't seen that part of history, stories about the future are always going to be elevated in terms of narrative, context, possibility, et cetera. I think there's that great quote about we underestimate technology in the long term and we overestimate it in the short term, right? And that's where these stories about what can happen with robots actually can really come down to dictate how we think and feel and what we do. Like Stanley Kubrick's 50th anniversary, 2001: A Space Odyssey just came out, or not just came out, the anniversary just happened. And so many things that appeared in that movie now exist in real life because people make what they imagine. So if you imagine this narrative of humans are going to become dependent on robots because they will have evolved so far, that's a narrative that you might work towards happening inside of your work, right? Something interesting to think about.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's just so interesting. To give you a little brief insight into why some people may feel more afraid of robots than death, it's a quality of life and not wanting to give up eye contact and flesh-touching, sensual life, the trees, the grass, stones, bugs, not wanting to give that up for something synthetic and something digital. And so that's it's an age thing probably, but that just I wanted to express to you what might be going on there. And my question in connection with that is, can't the robots be made more beautiful and more aesthetically pleasing and more touchy-feely and more lovely?
Yes, so thank you so much. I know Andra mentioned yesterday the Disney 12 laws of how they design robot or any animated character. They have these like 12 things that they've picked up on that will immediately create empathy, the bilateral symmetry of the eyes, moving in a certain way. I could not agree more. So a major question that I have, if I want to buy a robot and I'm a woman, who made a robot that's for me to buy? Nobody, right? Like all of these robots that I work with have biceps. They all have masculine names. Their vocal inflections, again, whether it's in a servile mode or a dictative mode, have been divided, right? So who made a robot that's for me? If I want to go out and buy 10 robots, where are they? No one's made them for me, right? Like there's a huge opportunity there. What do women want out of robots? Big question. Who's answering that right now? Genuinely, please tell me. Because if I look at all the people who are employed by Boston Dynamics, nobody looks like I do, right? And so I think that there is actually a huge opportunity for people who come from artistic, psychological, philosophical fields to contribute to this very idea. Oh my gosh, what if I had a robot that brought me flowers? What if I had a robot that we go out into the garden and the grasslands and it finds where the glass is and it picks it up so I don't scratch my feet, right? Isn't that a kind of a beautiful vision for a robot? I don't see that on the media. I don't see that in the news, and no one's making that robot, right? And so I completely agree with you, and I feel like we are seeing this narrow slice of what robots can be in the world, what they can do, based on not only who makes them, but the stories that we tell about them, right? I have this like good friend of mine, Ariane. She has a 4-year-old son named Everest, and he just recorded this long voice memo to me. Katie, I want to make a robot that goes around Central Park and picks up all of the trash. Because I go to Central Park, I'm 4 years old, and there's trash everywhere, and I don't like that. Will you help me make that robot? Oh my gosh, what a better vision for a robot than the Terminator, right? Like, this is where, and it like seems like humor, but we create what we imagine. The stories we tell ourselves is what winds up happening. And actually, we're kind of trying to submit this giant NSF grant to just create a big space where people can go and move around with robots that aren't scary. Because I think some of this fear is also because you've never had an experience with so it's like fear of the unknown, fear of the narrative, and fear of what could occur in the future. And no one else, I would love to see the example of someone who has created a robot that will only pick daisies and bring them to you.
Thank you so much again. Okay, so as we prepare for the third and last presentation this morning, we're going to take a quick break again. For those of you who would like to, if you go up on the left there, we have Scott Hartley's book available, and Scott will be there to sign it for you if you would like to do that, The Fuzzy and the Techie, so you can check it out. And we'll be back in about 5 minutes for the last presentation. Thank you.
It's a little hard to explain.
Oh, no, you're right on. I think everybody really understood. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, really excited.
Yeah, we'll talk some more. I'll let you talk to the audience. Okay, we are about to start again. Please return to your seats. Okay, thank you very much. And it's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague from the College of Humanities. We are very excited to have him present today. Tyler Meyer is the Poetry Center's Executive Director in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. Prior to coming to the Poetry Center, he served as Managing Editor at the Kenyon Review and co-director of the Kenyon Review Young Writers Workshop. He received an MFA from the University of Washington, and his poetry and nonfiction have appeared in At Length, AGNI, Laurel Review, Bad City Review, Jubilat, Washington Square, Thermos, Forklift, Ohio, and elsewhere. He will present today on Attention and Abstraction, Poetry in the Digital Age. Please welcome Tyler Meyer.
Can you guys hear me okay? It doesn't seem like this is, oh, it's on now, maybe? Can you hear me okay? Not so good? It seems like it's on, but maybe not so good. How about, or maybe it's upside down. I need a robot who knows how to put on a microphone. I'd also take a robot that knows how to make a fire or something like that. It's really cold in here. You guys have been here for a while. You get points for surviving. There's treatment for hypothermia if anyone has it, just outside the doors. I'm just kidding. I'm happy to be here. I feel a little bit like the kid who's doing his own thing, but I'm also really pleased to have a chance to speak with all of you, and just want to start with a bunch of thank yous. Thank you to the Dorrance Scholars for being here. It's amazing to be in front of this array of talent and creativity in front of me, and I'm excited to get to know all of you a little bit more. So thanks for being here. And thanks to Jim Hensley for his role in all of this. Thanks to AP for putting this together. Many people in red shirts in the back who help put these things together and make them happen. So grateful to all of you guys. My wife Katie is here. She tolerates me, and I'm grateful to her in so many ways. So thank you, Katie. I'm going to talk about attention and abstraction and poetry in the digital age. And I think about this. So I work at the Poetry Center at the U of A. I'm excited. Some of you visited the Poetry Center yesterday. Yes, okay, good. How many of you have been to the Poetry Center? Yeah, fair number. So many of you, very good. So if you have been, the first part of this will be a little bit familiar, so you can almost sing along to this part of the talk. And if you haven't been to the Poetry Center, this will be a little bit of an orientation. But I want to argue or make some argument that poetry has something to offer us as our age increasingly becomes digital and digitalized. Information, things that are changing, that poetry might have something to say. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what a Poetry Center is, or at least the version of it and the vision we have for it here in Tucson. It's a lot of different things. And the best way to start is to show you guys a movie. So I'm going to see if this is going to work. It's just 1.5 minutes, so it's quick. It's made for the digital age.
Here, in our home in Tucson, we have what's been called the greatest living room in America for reading poetry. The Poetry Center houses one of the largest poetry collections in the world, but the poems and the poets go far beyond these walls. They meet their readers. They inspire writers of all ages, and they catalyze conversation. These poems participate in other art forms, and they speak to and through the times, redefining what it means to read, as well as to write. And since 1962, our Visiting Writer series has revised the script of what a poetry event can be. These poems are not restrained by page or place. They travel to other creative spaces. And our educational programs develop creativity in young learners and sharpen the practice of working writers. The University of Arizona Poetry Center expands with our ever-changing poetry community, breaching boundaries of language so that we can listen, so that we can attend and reconceive our world, so that we can share. This is your center.
Great, right? Exciting. It's worth applause. I spent all last night working on the glockenspiel for the music, so I'm glad that that came through okay. I'm sad that it was so quiet in the beginning. We think about the Poetry Center in a lot of different ways, and we often talk about the Poetry Center as a living archive. And by living archive, what I like to suggest is that we're attending to the history of poetry, and we're thinking about that and what we're doing with our collection, how we collect, what we do with that collection, how we tell the story of the history of poetry, how we preserve, how we make that preservation accessible to others. But the living part is also equally important into how we think about the work of the Poetry Center. Poetry is an evolving form. It's changing. It's moving forward. And so part of the work, as much as it is in collecting the books that we do, is also presenting poets who are at the forefront of what's happening with poetry. We have a robust reading series where we're bringing poets each year, 20 to 25 poets to Tucson to come do presentations. We have a lot of outreach to the university, a lot of outreach to the K-12 community in Tucson, working with students, thinking about education, how we talk about poetry in classroom settings and spaces. There's community conversations and workshops. So we think about how the Poetry Center might be all these different things in ongoing ways. Our mission is to advance a diverse and robust literary culture. And all of these programs activate some version of that mission, and we put attention towards what we think about in regards to this idea of a robust and literary culture as well, often. It changes, so we think about it often. There are 80,000 items in the Poetry Center's collection, 50,000 books. And so when you walk through the doors of the Poetry Center, let's say a poetry book on average has about 80 poems in it, give or take. Some have a lot more, some have a little bit less. You're in the presence of 4 million poems. And that's a really rare thing. It's incredibly rare. I'm not sure it's possible to have an experience of being adjacent to that much poetry physically anywhere else in the world like it is here in Tucson. We really value that. I think it's a value that we want to celebrate. And you could touch each one of those poems if you wanted to. It would take a long time. But it's possible, right? They're all there physically. Within that 80,000 items, there's also a collection that we call VOCA. And we've been recording visiting poets when they come to read in Tucson for an archive of audiovisual poetry. And that archive is about 1,000 poets long. Each of those readings happened in Tucson. It's a really incredible way to tell the story of the 20th century. And so I want to share one piece of that archive with you guys. So this is a picture and a poem from Robert Creeley. The poem is called For Love. This is actually a robot of Robert Creeley. It's not the real Robert Creeley. No, that's the real Robert Creeley. Creeley, an amazing poet, right? An important poet of the 20th century, one of my favorites. He bookends our collection, our VOCA archive. So Creeley is where we begin that audiovisual archive, and it moves forward to the work that we do today, hosting visiting poets and recording their presentations as well. So Creeley was in 1963. This is a poem called For Love. I think it's a good one to share with you. So just take a second. We haven't listened to enough poems yet in these presentations. So here's one that we'll start with. And you can follow along if you like, or close your eyes and just listen. And I hope this will work. It might work. Oops.
For love. Yesterday I wanted to speak of it, that sense above the others to me. Let me start that again. Yesterday I wanted to speak of it, that sense above the others to me important, because all that I know derives from what it teaches me. Today, what is it that is finally so helpless, different, despairs of its own statement, wants to turn away endlessly, to turn away? If the moon did not, no, if you did not, I wouldn't either, but what would I not do? What prevention, what thing so quickly stopped? That is love yesterday, or tomorrow, not now. Can I eat what you give me? I have not earned it. Must I think of everything as earned? Now love also becomes a reward so remote from me I have only made it with my mind. Here is tedium, despair, a painful sense of isolation and whimsical, if pompous, self-regard. But that image is only of the mind's vague structure, vague to me, because it is my own. No, because it is my own. Love, what do I think to say? I cannot say it. What have you become to ask, what have I made you into? Companion, good company, crossed legs with skirt or soft body under the bones of the bed. Nothing says anything, but that which it wishes would come true, fears what else might happen in some other place, some other time, not this one, a voice in my place, an echo of that only in yours. Let me stumble into not the confession, but the obsession I begin with now, for you. Also, some time beyond place, or place beyond time, no mind left to say anything at all, that face gone now, into the company of love, it all returns.
Wow, right? Pretty incredible, right? Exciting. Straight out of 1963, Folk as a Time Machine. It's amazing to be able to hear Creeley say that in his voice, but not Creeley, a latter Creeley. This is Creeley at that moment in time, at that point in his career, reading a poem that I find exceedingly beautiful. I love the beginning of this poem especially. I think about it a lot. Yesterday I wanted to speak of it, that sense above the others, to me important because all that I know derives from what it teaches me. And I think, in a nutshell, Creeley has kind of gotten at what poetry maybe is trying to struggle with all the time, how to get the world into words, the challenge of that, the failures of language, what language is challenged to do, what the poet struggles to do, the difficulty. It's only a sense. It's difficult to do. And yet, somehow, there's this understanding that all knowledge comes from that. Some important understanding comes out of this thing that's incredibly impossible and difficult to do. That duality, that complication. I love how Creeley thinks of that. Or the line, nothing says anything but that which it wishes would come true. Nothing says anything but that which it wishes to come true. We make the world with language, this line suggests to me. Right? We hope for the world that we want by articulating it in the language that we have, the struggle to put it into words. So that's a poetry center. But that's a version of a poetry center. It's one way to think about it. I wanted to share just some of those resources with you. So thank you, Robert Creeley, for visiting us today from 1963. What does this have to do with the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything? I'll gloss these slides quickly. Some of my other presenters who've done an incredible job. It's such a pleasure to be here among this group of presenters, and I've learned so much. Have already talked a lot about this, so I just want to just sort of point back to this quickly as we think about this to make the point that I want to make about poetry. Internet of Things, Internet of Everything. This is a slide that comes from an online presentation from Cisco Systems. It's dated, it's from 2012. It's actually a picture of my childhood and recent professional life in some ways. You can see here the evolution of computing and sort of how we access points to the internet. And so simply what you see here is that 1995, we imagined computers not unlike this one, although it was bigger and squarer. Inside a room in your house, maybe, you would go to that room, get on the internet. The internet lived in that room on that computer. You got up and you walked away. The internet was not elsewhere in your home, right? That's the way a lot of us started with computers. Moving into mobility, so the computers get smaller. They become laptops. They come with you. You can carry them around, our phones and our tablets. Fast forward into this Internet of Things. Our devices are connected, our thermostats, our cars, our glasses, the solar inverter on the house. All of these things are talking to the internet, providing information, connecting with it. Up to this point that Kevin pointed to yesterday, where something like 50 billion things are estimated to be connected, to be online within this vast network of information sharing in the relatively near future, by 2020. It's a huge number of things. This slide sort of articulates this in a similar way. So you can see world population growth. You can see the number of connected devices. And again, this point that Kevin made yesterday that I just want to gloss again, this number of connected devices per person is rising astronomically, right? In the Internet of Things, we're connecting our devices to talk to each other in more radical and sophisticated ways. So somewhere between 2003 and 2010, we crossed the threshold in which there are enough devices per person connected. There's a one-to-one match. This is estimating somewhere by 2020 that there will be something like 6 or 7 devices or more per person in that time frame. The quote here is from the New Yorker from the middle of the month of May. And it talks about that 45 years ago, this person walked out on a sidewalk in Manhattan and made the first cellular phone call, right, for context, to get some sense of sort of how far and how radically this is changing. That was the first cell phone call that happened. And here we are now. And then there's this kind of incredible quote at the end that says a UN study found that more people own mobile devices than they do toilets. And I don't know what that means, but I imagine that it's some sort of expression of values that we should be careful of. Your phones can't do everything. They can do so much, but some things they cannot do. This is an old slide, but I left it in here. It's important to me. All of this connection, all of this interactivity, as providing a vast amounts of more information. There's more inputs, uploads, bits and bytes flowing through the system that have ever been there before. This is 2008. This feels like literally decades ago, a long, long time ago. So this is estimating 5,000 exabytes of data. This slide, the next one and this one that I've borrowed from the Cisco slides online, would talk about 1.2 zettabytes. Kevin talked about brontobytes. These numbers to me feel like what I would tell my brothers when we were doing our futures for each other. We'd say we'd have $1 million, gajillion, bazillion dollars when we got older and have healthy and happy lives full of cars and large houses. That's sort of the scale of this. This is the amount of information that's being created in regular ways, in regular times. And so what we pay attention to and what we need to pay attention to, there's just a lot more of it out there. And there's a lot more information to process, to know about. And we've heard my colleagues talk about what this might mean for how machine learning can help support human life, human endeavor. The great attention commodity. So this comes from an article that was in the New York Times by the writer Tim Egan. The article was called The 8-Second Attention Span. Does anybody know this article or know something about this? Some of you do. It was debunked. That it was based on a study that Microsoft did that was debunked as not a very academic study, right? That it was a study that was more pivoted towards marketers than it was towards, say, stable knowledge about our actual attention spans. But the thrust of what the study suggested was interesting. And essentially it was that the human attention span was changing radically. It was getting shorter. Ostensibly this had something to do with all of our connectivity and all of this information that was in the world, and that it was roughly less than what a goldfish had, right? That it was about 8 seconds. And that was what the article was suggesting. Again, academically, this does not stand up to rigor or pass muster. Microsoft is the one who did the study. But it was the sense that our attention spans are changing, right? Possibly true, possibly not. But the thing that I found fascinating in the article was this quote that's in bold at the bottom. And this is from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. And he says, "The true scarce commodity of the near future will be human attention," right? The true scarce commodity of the future will be human attention. I found this very interesting, right? To think of attention like we might think of copper or water or rare earth elements, right? Something finite needed in a process of production, a kind of resource that if we didn't have enough of it, we couldn't do exactly what we wanted to do. And that notion that attention was finite was one that I really got centered on. So that's one side of what I want to talk about next, is sort of how attention might work, what we think about attention as sort of one edge of the digital age, and as a commodification of that idea of attention. This quote is from Tad Friend, who did a kind of omnibus article that was titled, "How Frightened Should We Be of Artificial Intelligence?" As Katie pointed out, this is an interesting way to approach this, right? It's kind of a fear-mongering title. And Friend did a sort of omnibus review of a lot of recent books about artificial intelligence. And it's interesting to me sort of where this article goes. It tracks sort of the outer edge of what may happen with artificial intelligence at its extreme, right? Maybe its scariest extreme. And what the quote says, AGI, artificial general intelligence, so the machine can think for itself and do sort of human processes, may be a recurrent evolutionary cul-de-sac that explains Fermi's paradox. While conditions for intelligent life likely exist on billions of planets in our galaxy alone, we don't see any. Sidebar here, we probably need Kevin's telescope from yesterday to be able to see that life. So once the telescope is up there, maybe things will be different. But back here to Tad Friend. He's quoting here Mark Tegmark. And Mark Tegmark is a physicist at MIT. He's the founder of something called the Future of Life Institute. His book is called Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So here, we don't see any life, right? Tegmark concludes in his book that it appears that we humans are a historical accident and aren't the optimal solution to any well-defined physics problem. It's kind of a radical thing to say, right? This suggests that a super intelligent AI with a rigorously defined goal will be able to improve its goal attainment by eliminating us. Therefore, to program a friendly AI, we need to capture the meaning of life. Says Ted Friend. The meaning of life. Okay, so that's all we need to do. And I'm so happy to have it laid out so clearly so that we'll know exactly what's necessary for the sort of outer edge of artificial intelligence and how to keep it under control. This is what I think of as abstraction. So if we have attention on one side as a requirement for what we need to do to participate in the digital age, and this sort of abstract thinking that can lead to the kind of artificial intelligence and the controls, the ethics, the morality that's necessary to make artificial intelligence do the best possible work that it might do, to be friendly, then we need to figure out how to navigate between these two things. And one feels to me very much like a great zoom in, attention on the most specific details, and one feels like an incredible zoom out. And the veer back and forth is a space that I think poetry might have a role to teach us about. So, what was that role for poetry again? Some of you will know the poem The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Eliot wrote that poem sort of staring into the grill work of the 20th century and its great modernist moment. The poem ends with the famous 3 lines. Does anybody know the last 3 words of the shanti, 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 right? Or it's a part of the poem, right? Borrowed from the Sanskrit. I think sometimes what would Eliot write if Eliot were staring into this moment with all of its bits and bytes, the great attention necessary and the great zoom out necessary. And perhaps it would be Alexa, Alexa, Alexa. Or some other way of thinking about this. What would change for how he would think about what was necessary to write the poem about the moment that we find ourselves in? Already in my house, I know that we probably say the word Alexa more than any other word, which is a little scary to contemplate. So I'll start this part just by sort of suggesting a couple ways that I think poetry has thought ahead about what the internet is, how it works, and how we use it, and point to those quickly, and then talk a little bit about some ideas about poetry that I think might help us with this great veer between attention and abstraction that I think defines the sort of what comes next. So I want to talk about this first. This is a poem by Sappho, and I'm borrowing an idea from the poet Srikanth Reddy, who visited Tucson recently as part of a group of poets that were here doing lectures about poetry. And one of the things that Srikanth said in his talk was that, well, we all know that the original selfie was a lyric poem, right? We all know that. And I thought, no, I didn't know that, but of course it's true. And so I spent a little time thinking about this, and there's an element to this that seems correct, right? How we think about ourselves, what we say about ourselves, how we present ourselves. Lyric poetry has been thinking about this for a long time. So this is Sappho. This is one of the Sapphic fragments, and this goes, "The moon has left the sky, lost is the Pleiades' light. It is midnight, and time slips by, but on my couch alone I lie." You can almost picture it, right? I'm alone, it's midnight, I'm bored, I'm sad, I'm a little depressed, click, I upload to Instagram, right? Sappho did it first, right? And so if you really want to learn about the best ways to imagine what selfie culture means or how we think about it, you might do well to go back to the ancient Greeks and look a little bit at what has come before us. I do like the idea of thinking often, and I think about this a lot, about how poetry mates to social media in a way that feels particularly suited for it, in a way that other art forms aren't necessarily so. You can share a poem in social media partly because it's short, partly because it's this turbocharged language that fits in a small space as a stand-in to say something about how you feel, about Mother's Day or getting your taxes done or the president or whatever you want to do. And that poem might say something meaningful and powerful in a special way. And I think poetry fits in an email and social spaces like social media differently and better. We can't share novels in the same way. Ballet doesn't fit in that space. A symphony doesn't quite work. You can't put a mural there in the same way. Poetry you can. So I think a little bit about that. And in some ways, maybe Sappho has done something about that too with her short fragments. Does anybody recognize this person? Whitman. Very good, yeah. I thought a little bit about the talk yesterday where the computer was learning language by feeding Tolstoy through the computer, right? Remember this? People who were here yesterday? If you weren't here, ostensibly the computer was learning language by reading Tolstoy over and over and over again and getting closer and closer and closer to being able to put out its own kind of language that mimicked what it was learning from Tolstoy. I mean, the interesting thing is, can the computer ever write better Tolstoy than Tolstoy? Or could we have a new Tolstoy novel now because the computer learned how to do it? I thought a lot about that. Whitman, someone I think about a lot, of course, celebrated for his sort of expansive, inclusive, democratic verse, also had really horrible and terrible racist prose that balances some of this thinking that was in the inclusivity of his poems. Often is celebrated as a forefather of free verse, for sort of making the notion of free verse possible in a way that didn't exist before he came and did what he did with Song of Myself, which I think is very much true. People also will point out that Whitman in some ways was sort of a voice of America at the time, and I think that ugliness and the sort of newness of what the free verse did, paired with his own complicated sense of himself, is kind of a version of America that was probably accurate, right? Its sort of possibilities and all of its terrible history embedded within it. But more and more I thought about how this poem, if you thought of what the internet might write, if it could create its own ability to speak for itself, it might write Song of Myself. That might be the voice of the internet. And that's what I started to think about a little bit. So I'm going to read a little bit of this, and you can close your eyes and imagine that I'm the internet speaking to you with its sentient ability to now create its own poetry, and see what you think about this. Whitman was writing in 1865. I mean, even Whitman's ugliness also is a way it sort of embodies what is possible in the internet, of its possibility and also its horror. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed of this soil, this air, born here of parents, here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard, nature without check and original energy. The voice of the internet, maybe? I don't know. Possibly, right? There's a way in which Whitman, I imagine, some of this expansiveness could have been what the internet might do if it could speak for itself. Is it just coincidence that the initials are WW for Whitman, WWW? I don't know, right? But there's a possibility in which poetry has pre-thought some of what we find ourselves in right now. And I just want to hint at that, right? Sappho selfies, Whitman is the voice of the internet, the scary voice of the internet, the incredible voice of the internet. But pivoting away from that, some ideas about poetry itself and what poetry might teach us, again, about this veer between attention and abstraction that typifies the moment that we find ourselves in. I want to bring this quote from Wallace Stevens. This comes from an essay that Stevens has called The Noble Writer and the Sound of Words. This is a paraphrase of it, but ostensibly the notion is poetry is a place where we can preserve our imaginations, right? Kind of an incredible concept about what poetry is or might be, that we might be able to go to poetry to let our imaginations be their most possible selves, right? Their wildest, most robust, most possible selves. And also to protect them in some way, to preserve them, to give them some space to do something that outside of poetry might be diminishing our imaginations. That's the part of this that I find a little bit eerie, but also prescient, that somehow Stevens might be suggesting our everyday lives dull the imaginations, weaken them, don't let them live up to their potential. But if we go to poetry, this sort of physical space of poetry, our imaginations might thrive in this new possible way. So that's one idea about how we might manage this veer between attention and abstraction, that we might go to poetry as a way to activate our imaginations, right? To be a place where we might preserve them, and might make a space for them so they can exist in their best possible way. The poet Mary Ruefle, a poet that I love so much, has a couple of definitions that are worth talking about. So the first one here is called Is Madness, Rack, and Honey, right? And this is the title of a book that Mary wrote. It's an incredible name, Mary Ruefle. It sort of holds the opposites within her name itself, to be merry and rueful at once. Madness, rack, and honey was her idea of an amalgam that would define what poetry is, that this sort of ability to hold these dual ideas that sometimes feel mutually exclusive in one space defines what poetry makes possible. And so the rack of poetry is the way that we sometimes it's possible to get the world into words, and that sweetness, that overwhelming feeling of sort of that kind of connection is exciting, and that's the honey of poetry. The rack, of course, the poets work to stretch the language as far as is possible, to see how far it will go, to do the work that it's not always equipped and suited to do, to sometimes fail. That torture feels like the rack of poetry. And the madness is that the poem itself might hold these different ideas in one space. So Rueful's idea, madness, rack, and honey, that this is where we can understand what poetry is. When she was here visiting in Tucson during a Q&A that happened at the Poetry Center, someone asked, what's the definition of poetry? And she said, it's a linguistic configuration of energy, which I think is a kind of remarkable idea in and of itself, as if poetry is a little quark or part of an atomic structure, that it's a thing made of words with some kind of shape, right? The linguistic configuration that has a special kind of energy that imbues it. And that when those conditions are present, there's a possibility for poetry. So Stevens, a preserve for the imagination. Rueful, this idea that poetry is madness, rack, and honey, right? This quote comes from the poet W.H. Auden, and it comes from the famous poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats, the elegy for the great Irish poet, Nobel laureate. You often sometimes see this first line quoted by itself. Has anybody seen it by itself? Poetry makes nothing happen. You never have. Great. Then I don't have to fix any of those problems. I hear it a lot. Poetry makes nothing happen, and sometimes people will just leave it at that. But the context of the rest of the stanza is everything, and it matters greatly. And so I wanted to at least include that. It's somewhat criminal not to have the whole poem, but it's good to be risky. So we'll just go with the stanza that we have. And this stanza goes, for poetry makes nothing happen, it survives. In the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. I love this for all sorts of reasons. This idea that poetry makes nothing happen, no thing happen, in opposition to what the Internet of Things makes possible, right? It's making everything possible. Everything could happen. Poetry might be, and one of the ways that Auden, I think, thinks about it, a way to arrest or to still us in some ways, to cause a moment of reflection that is not a part of the grand churn of what all of this connectivity that the Internet makes possible. It makes nothing happen. And then the idea that poetry survives, right? That it's alive in some way, right? And that it finds a way to endure despite odds. This notion of it being raw towns that we believe and die in, I love Auden's imagination here that poetry is a space where belief is possible, and that the poem itself, across the distance of the poem, might be a belief-making space. And finally, that it makes nothing happen, but it is a way of happening. Poetry ultimately is a mouth, right? A mouth, something that's very hard to put on a robot. Oracular, wild, responsive to the world, right? And a place, of course, where language comes from. And language, and our choices with language, how we use language, I think ultimately is the fingerprint, one of the fingerprints that we put on the world, right? It's one of the opportunities that we have to mark the notion that we were here. And for at some point we use language in this place and put a fingerprint into this world in a particular way. Poetry is a mouth, oracular and wild. This is a picture of Czesław Miłosz, another great poet of the 20th century, a poet who lived a hard 20th century, a poet of Europe who was exiled to the United States because of all of the history of that continent during that century. And he has this line that language is the only homeland. And I like to think of this as in connection to the note from Auden just before. Language is the only homeland. I find it both profoundly sad and incredibly exciting. Sad in the sense that, of course, for Miłosz, it really was the only homeland that was left. There was no home to go back to. And so his work with words was, in a way, a sense of sort of where he was from. But also this imaginative possibility that language and the way that we articulate the things that matter to us, how we talk about the things that we value, can be a maker space, can be the thing that defines who we are in really profound ways. And so this notion that language is the only homeland, I find incredibly rich in a lot of ways. It can be very much where we are from and define us. And how we get, in some ways, the word into words. This is a picture I want to talk about here in a second, but this idea of what we put into language, I do think ultimately this is what defines us. And this says something about us, what we value, who we are. It is, in a way, this fingerprint that's on the world. The poet Robert Hass, in his essay collection, The 20th Century Pleasures, an incredible book of essays, he talks about the life of the image and talks about the image as a building block for both poetry but also for how we understand our lives. And a succession of images, what they might mean in succession, what the syntax of that succession of images might suggest. Hass is interested in thinking about, in this essay collection about images. And there's a little bit of it that I'm going to read right now. You can focus on this image, if you like, while I just read this little short paragraph. And this is, again, Robert Hass talking. He says, images haunt. There is a whole mythology built on this fact. Cézanne painting until his eyes bled, Wordsworth wandering the lake country hills in an impassioned daze. Blake describes it very well, and so did the colleague of Tu Fu, who said to him, it is like being alive twice. I love that idea, the idea that the image and experience of it is like being alive twice. Our experience of the world is one thing. Putting that into language and into words is like being alive a second time, to experience it twice. Back to Hass here. Images are not quite ideas. They are stiller than that, with less implication outside themselves. And they are not myth. They do not have explanatory power. They are nearer to pure story. Nor are they always metaphors. They do not say, this is that. They say, this is. In the 19th century, one would have said that what compelled us about them was a sense of the eternal. And it is something like that, some feeling in the arrest of the image that what perishes and what lasts forever have been brought in conjunction. What perishes and what lasts forever have been brought in conjunction. A pretty incredible idea, right? This notion of what images make possible. That for a split second, for a moment, we might feel this sense of ongoingness and also full of the knowledge that everything will be lost at the same time, right? And what Hass posits here is that done well in art, this notion of the image is an incredible thing. In my pocket, I have a device that has more images on it than we've had access to at any other time in the history of the world. And so I think in many ways the role of the poet, the role of the tech engineer who's taking a creative writing class or a class on French and translation is to help us think about the language that is necessary to get the world right. And in doing so, in getting the language right, and getting the world right, that we make things possible, like what Hass suggests, this notion potentially of the richness of the possibility of living twice. This is a picture of my father, and he's pulling his hay baler down the one-lane road in the area where I grew up. It's not unlike Illinois, where Katie was to work on the robots. So you can see on the right the feed corn fields, and on the left this field of a wheat field that had just been combined. I'm following my dad home. I can feel my whole childhood in this picture when I look at it, and I feel that notion that I'm arrested and that I can feel also something eternal and ongoing at the same time. It's rich for me in this moment. You may have images that are similar to this yourselves. So this idea, again, about what good is a poetry center, I want to sort of circle back to this and think a little bit about this some more, and then offer this up to you all for some questions to talk about poetry. We have more than 50,000 books in this collection, as I mentioned. When people ask me what we're doing with the Poetry Center, I like to tell them that we're collecting a record of our best uses of language. That's what our work is at the Poetry Center. We're collecting a record of our best uses of language. I'm often asked, why do we have a Poetry Center at a Research One university? What's the point of having a Poetry Center in a space like this? And sometimes I will say back something from Ezra Pound, which is poetry is original research in language. how we think about what we're doing with poetry is a kind of research that matters greatly and can be a part of what we think of the work. I like to look at this and think of a preservation for the imagination is possible here. This is a place that's full of madness, rack, and honey, that it's a place where we have many mouths trapped between the covers of books, where there's lots of possibility that comes alive in really compelling and exciting ways. And this, I think of in that space between attention and abstraction that is precisely what poetry might offer as a way to attend to how we move back and forth between these two modes. The age that will require us to focus in with specificity and attend to the narrowest and smallest details, and also zoom out to try to understand things like the meaning of life so that we can program in the best possible ways. Poetry has something, I think, really profound and important to say to us about this. The best thinking I've read about this is from a poet named Mark Doty, who wrote a book called The Art of Description. And so in a conversation about tech, I thought I would end by reading you just a small passage from a book of this kind of technology, which is still a kind of enduring technology. This is a very short passage. Doty's thinking here about how we describe the world, how complicated that is. He will be back to the Poetry Center soon, so he is a part of this ever-evolving sense of how poetry changes or moves in the landscape. And this is Doty again as a way to just sort of finish this thinking. And he says, critical theory is full of discussion of the inadequacies of speech, and it's true that words are arbitrary things, assigned to their objects in slippery ways, that we cannot rely on words to convey to another person what it is like to be ourselves. But we have nothing else. And when words are tuned to their highest ability, deployed with the strengths the most accomplished poets bring to bear on the project of saying what's here before us, well, it is possible to feel, at least for a moment, language clicking into place, into a relation with the world that feels seamless and inevitable. If that is a dream, so be it. At that instant, when language seems to match experience, some rift is healed, some rupture momentarily salved, and what Hart Crane called the silken, skilled transmemberment of song. What a crazy word, transmemberment. It suggests the exchange of body parts, one being fusing with another, a Latinate gloss on Shakespeare's sea change. I think of it as a kind of fusion between the word and the world, one becoming, at least in the floating instant, to paraphrase Crane, a part of the other, grown indistinguishable. The need to translate experience into something resembling adequate language is the writer's blessing or the writer's disease, depending on your point of view. If it is indeed a symptom of a problem, of life not having been really lived until it is narrated, at least that's a condition that winds up giving real gifts to others. The pleasure of recognizing a described world is no small thing. Thank you so much.
Questions?
Thanks for the great talk. I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
I noticed that you bring a book with you, and then actually my question is really about that little single detail, because I know that you can just pull out your cell phone and then Google it and then read on the screen. And then, so I was wondering, what do you think about like those online reading, those audiobook, and then reading on a paper book versus like reading electronically? How does this like impact the reading experience? Whether it helps the reading experience, we can have the more better communication with the reader, or that's like, no, not really. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great question. I think ebooks, digital books are incredible, right? And have done an incredible amount of making more text accessible. I think a personal preference is I will always choose a paper book over a device to read on. And I go to my device, I try to go to my device for different reasons besides reading. And partly that's the relationship that I want to have with the text and really with the person who's written it. And so for me, that happens best in a paper book. But that costs money, or it means having access to a great library. We're really lucky to have an awesome poetry library, so that helps me quite a bit. But yeah, my preference is often for the paper books. Although I don't begrudge, ebooks are incredible. And they've made the ability to read things so much more accessible, so much more possible in really incredible ways. So yeah, that's how I would answer. It's a personal preference for what you choose. And for me, I find my relationship to the writer and to the work that I'm reading happens for me better when I'm holding a print book. It also helps me to carry it around and to see it. It becomes kind of a part of my physical experience of the world. And that helps me too. And I really value that as well. If it's in a phone, it sort of doesn't exist. Yet it does, at least in my mind. So yeah, good question. I would say this too. I mean, one thing, I mentioned this a little bit in the talk, but I just maybe to expand on it. I love the way that poetry is interacting with social spaces and with email. And I truly feel like it's an art form that's doing this in a way that no other art form really is. It's possible to share a poem in an entirely different way than it is to share any other kind of art in those spaces, I think. And so, again, to have a little snip of some language that feels turbocharged and special, and to use it in that kind of space to stand in for something we want to say about the world, some emotion that we feel, it fits in that space really well. And I think it's causing a kind of resurgence in how people think about poetry. I think we see it more in those spaces than we might admit. I love my mother so much. I don't think she's bought a poetry book in the past few years. But I think she's probably read the equivalent of a poetry book in social media by seeing what I post and what my friends post. And that kind of readership is a thing that's worth valuing, right? It's a thing to articulate. It's a way that I think we're encountering the art form in different ways. And it's applied more specifically to our lived experiences in that way. So good question, yeah. Other questions? Hey, here's one. TJ, here's one right here. Yeah.
So I was recently reading Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and halfway through it, I got really frustrated because it's so hard to understand what he was doing, and I ended up finding myself just Googling what it meant, and then I felt like it just totally did him a disservice by just not sitting there and reading it over and over. So I don't know. Do you think
he's mad?
Yeah.
He's. I think he's probably frustrated. And go ahead.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I just don't know how to balance that, especially because I feel like most poetry books that are coming out now, not so much like Philip Levine or anything, who was more. He was wonderful, but I'm talking more of like R.H. Sin with like Whiskey Words and a Shovel. They're poems that are aimed into like instant gratification, you know, like.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I don't know if it's because of our inclination and the way that we behave on social media, but I guess it's how do we balance not just Googling everything and everything, like, I don't know, I feel like it is that way.
No, this is really good. There's a movie with Ben Stiller and Adam Driver. I don't know if anyone has seen this. And Ben Stiller is sort of this aging artist who's kind of past his prime. He never made the art that he wanted to make. And Adam Driver is this up-and-coming, hip, younger artist. And they're out to dinner together, and they're trying to remember something. And Ben Stiller says, "Oh, I'll just Google it. I can just Google it. It's a thing." And Adam Driver looks at him and says, "No, it's better not to know." As if that's suddenly cool now, right? Don't get your phone out. It's better not to know. What you're suggesting, I think I would not begrudge trying to get help while you're reading a poem to see what others have thought about it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I do think if you're giving it your best shot at reading it, then that's what really matters. Whitman is an endurance test, even for me, and I'm no expert. So it's okay to seek other resources to see how others have thought about it or parceled through it. And I think that's one of the ways we think about how we can know what we know about him. Part of his project was to be big and unruly and all over the place, difficult to contain. Shifting, right, pivoting between different ideas. And that can make kind of for messy reading. And I think that was part of his interest. Maybe he would be happy that you went to Google to look up more about him and wouldn't be as frustrated. So I wouldn't worry about going to find other resources, but I think as long as you're attending to the poem with the attention that you give it and that it deserves, then I think that's what really matters. It's also okay to not like Whitman. Right? That's fine. And I think, one of the things that's beautiful about reading is that the more we do, the more we develop a taste, the more taste we have. You might prefer to say, I just want to read Philip Levine poems. And that's okay. That's a beautiful thing too. So it's good to know why Whitman was important and what he meant, and it's good to know his flaws. But it's not necessary to like him, per se. So, yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
Over here. Yeah. Sorry. So I want to go back to the slide of and the name escapes me, of the author who likened language to homeland.
Yeah. Czesław Miłosz. Yeah.
So I was curious what it makes sense in his context as a political exile that he would do so, right?
Right.
But I thought back to the Cameroonian polemic writer Mongo Betty.
Okay.
And how he basically, in his anti-French and his francophone sort of movement, divorcing the French language from France, he basically views language as just a vehicle, no homeland, no heritage to it. And so I'm curious how technology will affect poetry and expression. And given that, I mean, for example, the English language dominates the internet. I think it's some ridiculous percentage.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how that will affect the extinction of indigenous languages and just minority languages.
That's a great question. You know, I don't know. I have hope, right, that we have a responsibility to work harder at preservation. And that matters as much as ever. You know, if there's more and more English in the world, if there's more and more information being produced each year by the internet, and that information exists in a way that gets translated in English mostly, you know, there's work that we need to do about preservation of other languages. Absolutely. There's amazing work that happens on campus with indigenous languages here, the American Indian Indigenous Languages Institute that happens each summer, where they're working with preservation of those languages of indigenous cultures that are under threat simply by the number of speakers diminishing. It matters to preserve those languages, right? Because those are, in a way, also a sense of a homeland, right? Those are places that we could be from. Studying languages is incredibly, incredibly valuable, right? It teaches you not only something about who you are, but also about someone else, someone different. Milosz also says that the purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to be just one person, which I find is a really beautiful way to express what poetry might make possible, how difficult it is to remain just one person. So these other kinds of knowledges, other ways of thinking from other cultures are really valuable. We've heard from others about how important that is in the room and the creation of tech and leadership circles, about having these sort of different voices there. So finding ways to preserve it, I think, will matter as much as ever in an increasingly digital space. Absolutely. Yeah. Other questions?
Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much again.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. What fantastic 2 days. I really want to take just 1 minute to thank again our external relations team from the College of Humanities and the IT team for their great work. Yeah, let's give them a hand for that. So, thank you all of our friends from the college who came here for these 2 days, our fantastic speakers. I have heard a lot of people telling me this was great. So we really appreciate all of your work and being here. And finally, thank you again very much to our alum Bennett Dorrance and the Dorrance Scholarship Program, Jim Hensley, for your support. You know, we totally share that vision that you have and that your students are following, you know, with how the humanities and the arts are going to be so important and are so important in this new fourth industrial revolution dominated by technology. So more than ever, as you have seen, I hope, and you know that the humanities are important and is going to play a central role. Thank you very much. Have a good day.